July 1871. The first steam locomotive of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad shrieked into the humid Kansas air, grinding its iron wheels against the newly laid tracks that ended abruptly in the tall prairie grass of Harvey County. This mechanical arrival signaled the death of the quiet prairie and the birth of Newton, a settlement constructed not for longevity but for the immediate and brutal extraction of profit from the Texas cattle trade. The railhead did not merely bring supplies, it brought a sudden, overwhelming influx of humanity that the landscape was ill-equipped to support. In the weeks prior, this location had been nothing more than open grasslands intersected by the slow-moving waters of Sand Creek. Now it was the focal point of a commercial collision between the industrial north and the agrarian recovering south. Men with sledgehammers and crowbars worked in shifts that stretched from dawn until the sun dipped below the western horizon. The sound of steel striking spikes echoed across the plains, a rhythmic pounding that drove the railroad deeper into the west. They laid ties cut from distant forests, smelling of creosote and sweat, placing them with precision on the graded earth. The rails themselves were heavy, requiring teams of men to lift and align them before they were spiked down. This physical labor transformed the geography. Where buffalo had recently grazed, a depot rose from the ground, followed quickly by makeshift structures of canvas and unseasoned lumber. The wood was green, often warping in the intense summer heat, creating gaps in the walls of the hastily erected buildings that lined the burgeoning Main Street. Newton was divided physically and morally by the very tracks that birthed it. To the north of the iron rails lay the beginnings of a respectable town, where merchants set up general stores and dry goods emporiums. Here, the ambitious men of the Newton Town Company plotted the future of the municipality, envisioning schools, churches, and a permanent population. They surveyed lots, drove stakes into the ground to mark property lines, and sold land to speculators who arrived on every incoming train. The air on the north side smelled of sawdust and fresh paint. But to the south of the tracks, a different reality took shape. This area, quickly dubbed Hide Park, was designated for the vices that accompanied the cattle trade. It was a district of saloons, dance halls, and gambling dens built to catch the wages of the drovers who would soon arrive from the south. The environment was hostile. The Kansas sun in July beat down with a relentless intensity, baking the earth until it cracked. Dust was a constant presence. It rose in clouds from the hooves of horses and the wheels of wagons, coating the skin and clothing of every person in town. It gritted between teeth and settled into the water barrels. When the rains came, the dirt streets turned into a thick, adhesive mud that trapped wagons to their axles and sucked the boots off pedestrians. There were no paved roads, no drainage systems, and no sanitation. Waste was thrown into the alleys or directly onto the street, baking in the heat and attracting swarms of flies that were a persistent plague upon the inhabitants. Into this raw setting rode the Texas cattlemen. They came up the Chisholm Trail, pushing herds of longhorns that numbered in the tens of thousands. These men had spent months in the saddle, facing river crossings, stampedes, and the constant threat of weather and bandits. They were hardened by the journey, their skin leathery from exposure and their patience eroded by fatigue. They wore wide-brimmed hats to shield their eyes and heavy leather chaps to protect their legs from the brush. Their spurs jingled with every step, a sound that became synonymous with the arrival of trouble in Newton. They carried large-caliber revolvers, typically Colts or Remingtons, worn high on the waist for accessibility. These were not ornamental weapons, they were tools of their trade, used for protection and increasingly for settling disputes. The economic engine of Newton was the cattle loading chutes. The railroad constructed extensive pens and chutes west of the town center to facilitate the loading of cattle onto stock cars. The process was loud and violent, Drovers used prods and whips to force the reluctant animals up the ramps and into the slatted wooden cars. The cattle bellowed in protest, their horns clashing against the wood and each other. Dust rose in choking plumes around the chutes, mixing with the smell of manure and fear. Railroad brakemen and conductors worked alongside the cowboys to ensure the trains were loaded efficiently. A fully loaded train could carry hundreds of head of cattle destined for the slaughterhouses of Chicago and markets further east. The exchange of money at these chutes was substantial. Gold coins and greenbacks changed hands, paying off the trail bosses who then distributed wages to their crews. With money in their pockets, the drovers crossed the tracks to Hyde Park. The contrast between the silent, lonely prairie nights they had endured and the noise of the town was jarring. Saloons like the Doña Ana and the Gold Room operated 24 hours a day. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke that hung in stagnant layers near the ceiling. Kerosene lamps provided a yellow, flickering light that cast long shadows against the rough-hewn walls. The floors were covered in sawdust to absorb spilled whiskey, tobacco juice, and blood. Bartenders served gut-warming liquor from unmarked bottles, the quality varying from genuine bourbon to harsh, chemically laced mixtures that burned the throat. There was no ice to cool the drinks. Everything was served at the ambient temperature of the room. The gambling tables were the center of activity in these establishments. Faro was the game of choice, a complex card game that allowed for high stakes and rapid play. Men crowded around the layout, placing their bets on the cards they hoped would be drawn from the dealing box. The dealer, often a professional gambler employed by the house, managed the game with practiced detachment. Arguments over bets were frequent. The exhaustion of the drovers, combined with alcohol and the adrenaline of gambling, created a volatile mixture. A misplaced chip or a perceived slight could escalate instantly into violence. There was no established police force to intervene. The town was in its infancy, and the concept of law enforcement was loosely interpreted by whoever held the strongest hand or the fastest gun. The population of Newton swelled to nearly 2,000 people during the height of the season, a transient mass of humanity that shifted with the arrival of each train and cattle drive. Among this crowd were the women of the dance halls. They worked in the establishments of Hyde Park, charging the cowboys for a dance or for companionship. Their lives were hard, defined by late nights, cheap liquor, and the rough attention of the drovers. They wore gaudy dresses to attract attention, the fabric stained with the dust of the floor and the sweat of their partners. The music in the dance halls was provided by fiddles and pianos, often out of tune, struggling to be heard over the din of conversation and the stomping of boots. The railroad brought more than just commerce. It brought a clash of cultures. The men who ran the railroad and the businesses on the north side were typically from the north or the east. They valued order, schedules, and profit margins. They viewed the Texans as necessary for business but culturally inferior, wild, uncouth, and dangerous. The Texans, in turn, viewed the Kansans and the railroad men with suspicion. To them, these were the people who had won the Civil War, the Yankees who now controlled the markets and set the prices for their cattle. The war had ended only 6 years prior, and the animosity remained just below the surface. Every interaction was colored by this history. A disagreement over the price of a drink or a rule at a card table was not just a personal dispute. It was a reenactment of the sectional conflict that had torn the country apart. In July, the sheer volume of cattle arriving in Newton overwhelmed the facilities. Herds had to be held on the prairie outside of town, waiting their turn for the loading chutes. This created a ring of camps around Newton, where thousands of steers grazed and cowboys waited. The nights were filled with the sounds of the herds, the lowing of cattle, the singing of night herons, and the crackle of campfires. But the cowboys did not stay in the camps. They rode into town in groups, seeking relief from the boredom of the wait. They raced their horses down the main thoroughfare, firing their pistols into the air and shouting rebel yells. This behavior terrified the residents of the north side, who boarded up their windows and stayed indoors after dark. The architecture of Hyde Park reflected its transient nature. Many buildings were single-story wooden structures with false fronts that extended above the roofline to give the illusion of height and grandeur. Behind these facades, the buildings were essentially shacks, hot in the summer and cold in the winter. The walls were thin, offering no protection from the noise of the street or the stray bullets that occasionally pierced the wood. Some businesses operated out of large canvas tents, the flaps tied open to allow for air circulation. Inside these tents, planks laid across barrels served as bars and crates served as chairs. The impermanence of the structures contributed to the sense that Newton was a temporary explosion of activity, a place where consequences were short-lived and the future was uncertain. Water was a critical resource and a source of difficulty. Wells were dug by hand, but the water was often brackish or contaminated by the lack of sanitation. Water wagons traversed the streets selling barrels of water brought from cleaner sources upstream. For the drovers who had spent months drinking from muddy rivers, the quality of the water was a secondary concern to the availability of whiskey. However, for the horses and the cattle, water was a matter of survival. The localized drought that struck in late July exacerbated the tension. The grass near the town was trampled and eaten down to the roots, forcing the herds further out and making the logistics of loading them more difficult. The heat and the dust intensified, shortening tempers and increasing the desperation of the men and the animals. The establishment of the deadline was an attempt to impose order. This was an unwritten but understood boundary separating the north side from the south side. Respectable women did not cross to the south side. The drovers were tolerated on the north side during the day when they were conducting business at the stores or the bank. But at night, they were expected to confine their revelry to Hyde Park. The bank was a fortress of brick and iron, one of the few permanent structures guarding the immense sums of cash generated by the cattle sales. Its vaults held the profits that justified the existence of the town. The bankers counted the money with dirty fingers, their ledgers recording the transfer of wealth from the chaotic south to the industrial north. As August approached, the influx of characters into Newton included not just cowboys and railroad men, but professional predators. Gamblers, con artists, and gunmen drifted into town, sensing the opportunity provided by the loose law and the flow of money. Men like Mike McCluskey arrived during this period. McCluskey, a rough man with a history of violence and a reputation as a heavy drinker, found employment in the chaotic environment of Newton. He was hired as a night policeman, a title that carried little official weight but authorized him to carry a weapon and enforce a semblance of order in the rougher districts. His authority came not from a badge, which was barely recognized, but from his physical strength and his willingness to use force. The Texans brought their own enforcers. Men like Billy Bailey, a Texan who had come up with the herds, walked the streets with an air of ownership. Bailey was known to be boisterous, often drunk, and fiercely loyal to his fellow Texans. He and McCluskey represented the two opposing forces in Newton, the hired muscle of the town attempting to control the uncontrollable, and the defiant spirit of the drovers who recognized no authority but their own. They circled each other in the saloons and on the streets, their interactions tense and laden with unspoken threats. The sounds of Newton at night were a cacophony of human excess. The piano music clashed with the shouting of men, the breaking of glass, and the occasional gunshot. The train whistle blew at regular intervals, a reminder of the machine that drove the town's existence. But under the noise there was a palpable current of danger. It was not a place for the weak or the hesitant. Survival required a constant state of alertness. A man walking from a saloon to his horse kept his hand near his weapon. and his eyes moving. Shadows in the alleyways could conceal a mugger or a rival. The darkness between the pools of light from the windows was absolute, as there were no street lamps to illuminate the hazards of the road. The sheer physical scale of the cattle drive that year was historic. Estimates placed the number of cattle moving toward Kansas in the hundreds of thousands. The grasslands around Newton were a sea of horns and hides. This concentration of biological mass created its own microenvironment. The ground vibrated with the movement of the herds. The air was heavy with the heat radiating from thousands of large bodies. The flies were so thick they formed black clouds that moved with the wind. The drovers wrapped bandanas around their faces to filter the air, their eyes red-rimmed and watering. In the dance halls, the social dynamics were rigid. The Texans dominated the floor, often excluding others from participating. They danced with a wild energy, stomping their boots in time to the music, swinging their partners with force. The local men, the railroad workers, and the store clerks watched from the periphery, resentment building with every song. The women were the currency of this social exchange, their favor sought after and fought over. A dance promised was a contract. Breaking it could lead to a brawl. The bouncers in these establishments were large men armed with clubs and brass knuckles, their job to drag the unconscious or the unruly out into the street. But even they hesitated to confront a group of armed Texans. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad continued its work, pushing the tracks further west even as Newton exploded with activity. The construction crews did not stop. They moved past the chaos of the town, laying rails toward the next horizon. But for the moment, Newton was the terminus, the end of the line. Everything stopped here. The cattle stopped, the money stopped, and the men stopped. It was a bottleneck of commerce and vice. The pressure built daily as more herds arrived and more men poured into the limited space of Hyde Park. The town was a pressure cooker with the lid screwed down tight by the heat and the greed of the season. By the end of July, the initial novelty of the town had worn off, replaced by a grim determination to extract as much value as possible before the season ended or the railroad moved on. The piles of lumber that had been stacked by the tracks were now buildings. The canvas tents were becoming fewer, replaced by wood. The mud of the streets had hardened into ruts that would remain until the winter snows. The distinctive smell of Newton, a blend of cattle, coal smoke, sawdust, and whiskey, had permeated everything. It was the scent of a boom town, sharp and unmistakable. The interactions between the northern lawmen and the southern cowboys became more frequent and more abrasive. Verbal sparring matches were common. A Texan would refuse to check his gun when asked by a town official. A policeman would rough up a drunk drover a little too enthusiastically. These small frictions were accumulating, building a reservoir of ill will. The Texans felt targeted, believed the town wanted their money but despised their presence. The town officials felt besieged, believing the Texans were an unruly mob that needed to be broken. The railroad agents watched it all from their offices, tallying the carloads and the receipts. To them, the violence was a line item, a cost of doing business. If a man was shot, he was buried in the plot of land designated as the cemetery, a patch of ground on the outskirts that was filling up faster than the town itself. The trains had to run, the cattle had to move. The machinery of the trade was indifferent to the human cost. As the sun set on the final days of July, the red light of the dying day bathed the raw wood of the buildings in a color that resembled dried blood. The heat did not dissipate with the darkness. It radiated back up from the ground, keeping the temperature high well into the night. In Hyde Park, the lamps were lit and the doors were thrown open. The music began, a siren song calling the men from the camps. They rode in, silhouetted against the twilight, their shadows stretching long across the dust. They were young men, heavily armed, far from home, and looking for trouble. And in Newton, in the summer of 1871, trouble was the one commodity that was never in short supply. August 11th, 1871. The sun rose over Newton like a furnace door swinging open, heating the prairie air before the dew had time to evaporate from the grass. This Friday was not an ordinary day of commerce and cattle loading. It was a day of political reckoning. The township was holding a special election, a contest that would determine the allocation of railroad bonds and, by extension, the balance of power between the newly arrived industrial interests and the chaotic, transient population that fueled the local economy. The ballot boxes were placed under guard, and the streets were filled with men who had been paid to ensure the voting went a specific way. The Santa Fe Railroad had a vested interest in the outcome, and they had employed men like Mike McCluskey to secure it. McCluskey moved through the morning crowd with the heavy, flat-footed gait of a man accustomed to using his size as a tool of intimidation. He was a rough figure, an Ohio native with a history that was rumored to be as violent as the town itself. His clothing was utilitarian, a mix of wool and canvas that was already stained with sweat by mid-morning. A pistol was tucked into his waistband, the handle worn smooth from constant handling. He was technically a night policeman, a title that gave him a thin veneer of legitimacy, but on this day he was a political enforcer. His job was to herd voters to the polls much like the drovers herded cattle to the chutes, using a combination of free whiskey and physical presence to guide their choices. The epicenter of the day's activity was the Red Front Saloon. This establishment, located on the south side of the tracks in Hyde Park, was a long, narrow wooden structure distinguished by its painted facade which gave it its name. The paint was peeling in the heat, revealing the raw pine underneath. Inside, the heat was stifling. The air was trapped by the low ceiling and the press of bodies. Men stood shoulder to shoulder at the bar, shouting over the noise to order drinks that were paid for by election agents. The floor was covered in a fresh layer of sawdust that was rapidly turning dark with tobacco spit and spilled beer. Billy Bailey stood near the center of the room, a focal point of noise and agitation. Bailey was a Texan, a gambler, and a man who wore his defiance like a badge. He had come up the trail with the herds and stayed for the action in Newton. He was dressed in the fashion of the drovers, with a wide-brimmed hat pushed back on his head and a silk bandana knotted loosely around his neck. His face was flushed with drink and the heat of the room. Bailey was not employed by the railroad, and he held a deep vocal contempt for the northern men who tried to run the town. He was loud, abrasive, and looking for a target for his aggression. As the morning turned to afternoon, the alcohol consumption in the Red Front reached a critical level. The voting process outside was chaotic, with accusations of fraud and intimidation flying between the opposing factions. Inside, the tension mirrored the streets. McCluskey entered the saloon, his eyes scanning the room. He was there to check on the men to ensure they remained motivated and, more importantly, to ensure they voted. His presence was an immediate irritant to Bailey. The two men had a history of friction, a series of small slights and confrontations that had built up over the summer months. To Bailey, McCluskey represented the hypocrisy of the town, a thug with a badge, a Yankee telling free men what to do. Bailey spotted McCluskey near the bar and raised his voice, ensuring his words cut through the din of the conversation. He made a comment about the election, a sharp, biting remark about the integrity of the railroad men and the quality of their hired help. The room quieted slightly, the men nearby sensing the shift in the atmosphere. They stepped back, creating a small circle of empty space around the two antagonists. McCluskey turned slowly, his face setting into a hard mask. He did not immediately draw his weapon. The room was too crowded and the situation was too volatile for gunfire. Instead, he walked toward Bailey, his hands closing into fists at his sides. The argument escalated quickly from political insults to personal attacks. Bailey, emboldened by the whiskey and the presence of his fellow Texans, taunted McCluskey, mocking his authority and his background. He called him a coward and a puppet for the railroad. McCluskey, whose temper was known to be short and violent, retorted with equal venom. The words were shouted, spit flying from their mouths as they closed the distance between them. The air between them seemed to vibrate with the potential for violence. It was a collision of two distinct archetypes of the frontier: the northern enforcer and the southern rebel. The first blow was struck with a suddenness that startled the onlookers. It was not a clean technical punch, but a wild, looping swing that connected with a wet thud against flesh. The impact knocked a glass from the bar, the sound of shattering glass signaling the start of the brawl. McCluskey and Bailey locked together, grappling for advantage. They crashed into a table, sending cards and chips flying across the room. Chairs were overturned as men scrambled to get out of the way. This was not a fair fight governed by the Marquis of Queensberry rules. It was a street brawl fueled by months of resentment. McCluskey used his weight to drive Bailey backward, slamming him against the rough wood of the wall. Bailey grunted, bringing his knee up sharply in an attempt to wind his opponent. They traded punches at close range, short, chopping blows that targeted the ribs and the kidneys. The sound of knuckles hitting bone was audible over the shouting of the crowd. Bailey managed to land a solid strike to McCluskey's face, splitting the skin over his cheekbone. Blood welled up instantly, running down into McCluskey's mustache. The sight of blood seemed to enrage the Ohio man further. He roared, grabbing Bailey by the lapels of his coat and hurling him toward the center of the room. Bailey stumbled but kept his footing. He reached for a heavy brass spittoon on the floor, intending to use it as a weapon, but a bystander kicked it away before he could grasp it. The Texans in the room cheered for Bailey, urging him to kill the policeman. The railroad men and the locals shouted for McCluskey to finish him. The saloon had transformed into an arena. The bartender, fearing for his mirror and his stock, grabbed a club and stood guard behind the bar, but he did not intervene. In Newton, you let the men fight until one of them could not stand. McCluskey charged again, lowering his head like a bull. He caught Bailey around the waist, lifting him off his feet and driving him down onto the sawdust-covered floor. The impact shook the floorboards. They rolled in the dirt and the filth, punching and the gouging and biting. McCluskey's hand clamped over Bailey's face, his thumb pressing into the Texan's eye socket. Bailey thrashed wildly, his boots scraping against the wood as he tried to find purchase. He managed to get a hand under McCluskey's chin, pushing his head back to break the hold. The fight was exhausting. The heat in the room was oppressive, and both men were gasping for air, their chests heaving. Sweat poured off them, mixing with the blood and the dust to create a grime that coated their skin. They scrambled back to their feet, swaying slightly. Bailey's shirt was torn open, revealing a chest heaving with exertion. His hat was gone, trampled somewhere in the sawdust. McCluskey's face was a mask of red, the blood dripping from his chin onto his shirt. They circled each other, looking for an opening. Then, with a mutual, unspoken agreement that the confines of the saloon were too small for their rage, the fight spilled toward the entrance. They crashed through the swinging bat-wing doors, tumbling out onto the wooden boardwalk and then down into the dirt of the street. The bright sunlight was blinding after the gloom of the saloon. A crowd gathered instantly, drawn by the noise and the spectacle. Men poured out of the red front and the neighboring buildings, forming a ring around the combatants. In the street, the fight became even more brutal. The dirt offered no cushioning. They grappled in the dust, kicking up a cloud that coated the onlookers. McCluskey landed a heavy blow to Bailey's jaw, snapping his head back. Bailey staggered, his knees buckling for a moment. McCluskey pressed the advantage, striking him again and again. Bailey was tough, hardened by the trail, but McCluskey was larger and stronger. The Texan began to lose ground. He swung wildly, missing more often than he connected. His blows lacked the power they had possessed minutes earlier. McCluskey delivered a punishing kick to Bailey's leg, sending him sprawling into the dust. Bailey tried to rise, but McCluskey stood over him, fists clenched, chest heaving. The fight had left both men battered. McCluskey's eye was swelling shut and his knuckles were raw and bleeding. Bailey was in worse shape, his face bruised and bloody, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked up at McCluskey with a mixture of hatred and defiance, but he did not get up to continue the physical assault. The fight had drained the immediate energy from them, leaving only the cold, hard residue of unresolved conflict. The crowd watched in silence now, waiting to see if guns would be drawn. It was the moment where a fistfight often turned into a murder. But neither man reached for his pistol yet. The physical exhaustion was too great. Bailey spat a mouthful of bloody saliva into the dirt, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He glared at McCluskey, his eyes promising retribution. McCluskey stared back, his expression grim. He had won the physical altercation, but he had not broken the Texan's spirit. Bailey slowly got to his feet, unsteady but upright. He brushed the dust from his trousers, a futile gesture given the state of his clothing. He turned his back on McCluskey and limped away, heading toward the darker recesses of Hyde Park. He did not run, but his departure was a retreat. The Texans in the crowd murmured among themselves, their faces dark. To see one of their own beaten by a northern policeman was an insult that would not be forgotten. McCluskey remained in the street for a moment, watching his adversary leave. He was breathing hard, the adrenaline slowly fading, replaced by the throbbing pain of his injuries. He knew this was not over. In Newton, a fight like this never ended with the final punch. It festered. It waited for the next opportunity. He turned and walked back toward the red front, the crowd parting to let him pass. He needed a drink to wash the taste of dust and blood from his mouth. He needed to clean his wounds. The election continued around them, but the mood had shifted. The violence at the red front had cast a shadow over the proceedings. The jovial atmosphere of the morning was gone, replaced by a tense vigilance. Men checked their weapons more frequently. Conversations were hushed. The sun beat down on the blood-spattered dirt where the two men had fought, baking the evidence of their conflict into the earth. Inside the red front, the bartender began to right the tables and sweep up the broken glass. The sawdust was raked over the bloodstains on the floor. Business resumed, but the laughter was forced. The piano player started a tune, but it sounded thin and tinny in the heavy air. The men drank with a sense of urgency, as if they were fortifying themselves against a coming storm. The word spread quickly through the town. McCluskey and Bailey had fought. Bailey had lost. The Texans were angry. As evening approached on the 11th, the town of Newton sat uneasily on the prairie. The trains continued to shunt cars in the rail yard, the clash of couplings echoing like gunshots. The cattle in the pens lowed softly. In the camps outside of town, the story of the fight was told and retold, growing in detail and intensity with each repetition. Bailey was painted as a martyr, a victim of Yankee aggression. McCluskey was the villain, the symbol of an oppressive order. The night of August 11th passed without further major violence, but it was a sleepless night for many. The heat did not break. The air remained thick and humid. In the shadows of Hyde Park, plans were whispered and grievances were nursed. Billy Bailey nursed his bruises and his pride, his anger hardening into a cold resolve. Mike McCluskey walked his beat, his hand never straying far from his gun. The fistfight had been the spark. The fuel was the dry, brittle tension of a town divided against itself. All that was needed now was the wind to fan the flames. The Red Front Saloon remained open late into the night, the lamps burning oil and casting a yellow light onto the street. Men came and went, their boots sounding hollow on the boardwalk. They spoke of the election results, which were contested and confused, but mostly they spoke of the fight. They analyzed the blows, the strategies, and the outcome. They placed bets on what would happen next. In a town like Newton, the future was always a gamble, and the odds of survival were shifting with every passing hour. The dust in the street settled, covering the tracks of the struggle. But the memory of the violence remained vivid. The physical reality of the confrontation, the sound of the punches, the sight of the blood, the smell of the sweat hung over the town. It was a tangible thing, heavy and suffocating. The people of Newton went to their beds or to their bottles, knowing that the score had not been settled. The ledger was open and the ink was red. August 12th, 1871. The dawn broke over Newton with a sullen gray light that offered no relief from the oppressive temperature of the previous day. The air was still thick with the dust that had been kicked up during the election fervor, hanging in the atmosphere like a suspended curtain of grit. On the south side of the tracks, the morning was slow to start. The dance halls and saloons were shuttered against the early light, their interiors dark and smelling of stale alcohol. The men who had populated them the night before were now asleep in canvas tents, boarding houses, or simply curled up in the alleys, sleeping off the excesses of the vote. But the tension that had been birthed in the fistfight between Mike McCluskey and Billy Bailey had not dissipated with the sunrise. It had merely paused, waiting for the participants to wake. Billy Bailey woke late in the morning. His body was a map of bruises from the beating he had taken the day before. His face was swollen, one eye partially closed, and his ribs ached with every breath he took. But the physical pain was secondary to the humiliation. In the culture of the Texas drovers, to be beaten by a northern policeman in a public brawl was a stain on one's reputation that required erasure. Bailey did not seek medical attention or rest. Instead, he sought the one thing he believed would numb the pain and restore his courage. He walked stiffly to the Red Front saloon, the site of his defeat. The Red Front was quiet at this hour. A few patrons sat at the tables, nursing drinks and speaking in low tones. The bartender was wiping down the wood, his movements slow and methodical. When Bailey entered, the conversation stopped. All eyes turned to the Texan. He walked to the bar, his boots scuffing heavily on the floorboards. He ordered whiskey, his voice raspy. He drank it quickly, the liquid burning his throat, and then he ordered another. With each glass, his volume rose. He began to speak to the room at large, retelling the events of the previous day, twisting the narrative to favor himself, claiming he had been outnumbered or cheated. He was looking for validation, but more than that, he was looking for Mike McCluskey. Mike McCluskey entered the Red Front shortly after noon. He was not looking for a fight, but he was not hiding from one either. He walked with the confidence of a man who had won the physical contest, his own face marked by the brawl, but his demeanor steady. He wore a gray coat, unbuttoned, revealing the pistol tucked into his waistband. He moved to the far end of the bar, acknowledging a few of the railway men with a nod. He saw Bailey immediately. It was impossible not to. Bailey was the loudest thing in the room, a source of noise and agitation that dominated the space. The confrontation began not with a shout, but with a look. Bailey turned from his drink and locked eyes with McCluskey. The alcohol had done its work. The Texan was loose-limbed and reckless. He pushed away from the bar, swaying slightly. He began to taunt McCluskey again, his words slurring but their intent clear. He called McCluskey a coward again, challenged his heritage, and insulted his mother. The insults were crude, designed to provoke a reaction, to force the policeman into a mistake. The other men in the saloon backed away, clearing the floor once more. They knew the unwritten script of the frontier. Words led to fists, and when fists failed, guns followed. McCluskey did not take the bait this time. He did not raise his voice or step forward to engage in another brawl. He stood his ground, his hand resting near his waist, his eyes cold. He told Bailey to go home, to sleep it off, to let it be. His voice was flat, devoid of the emotion that Bailey was projecting. This dismissal only enraged Bailey further. To be beaten was one thing. To be treated like a nuisance, like a drunk child, was intolerable. Bailey reached into his pocket not for a weapon, but to pull out a handful of coins which he slammed onto the bar, demanding more whiskey to fuel his rage. The bartender, sensing the inevitable slide toward violence, hesitated. He looked from Bailey to McCluskey, caught between the customer and the enforcer. McCluskey shook his head slightly, a silent order to cut the Texan off. Bailey saw the exchange. He swept the glass from the bar with a violent backhand motion, sending it shattering to the floor. He shouted that no Yankee policeman gave orders in Hyde Park. He turned and walked toward the door, shouting over his shoulder that he was going outside, implying a challenge that McCluskey was honor-bound to follow. McCluskey watched him go. The room was silent, the air heavy with expectation. McCluskey adjusted his coat. He knew that if he stayed inside, he would look weak. He would look as if he were afraid of the drunk Texan. His authority in the town, already fragile, relied on the perception of his dominance. He could not let Bailey walk away shouting insults without a response. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of tobacco and sweat, and walked toward the door. He pushed through the batwing doors and stepped out onto the boardwalk. The sun was high now, bleaching the color from the street. Bailey was standing in the dust of the road, facing the saloon, waiting. He had expected McCluskey to follow. When the policeman appeared, Bailey laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He had his hand near his own weapon, a revolver holstered at his hip. The distance between them was perhaps 20 feet. It was close enough to see the sweat beading on Bailey's forehead. Close enough to see the madness in his eyes. McCluskey stepped down from the boardwalk into the street. He did not close the distance this time. He stopped, planting his feet firmly in the dirt. He warned Bailey one last time. He told him to leave town or go to his camp, but to get off the street. Bailey ignored the warning. He reached for his gun. It was a clumsy draw, slowed by drink and the injuries to his hands. His fingers fumbled for the grip of the revolver. McCluskey did not fumble. His movement was efficient and practiced. He drew his pistol, a large-caliber revolver, in a single fluid motion. He did not aim for the extremities to wound or disable. He raised the weapon, extended his arm to stabilize his aim, and fired. The sound of the shot was a deafening crack that split the afternoon air, causing horses tied at the rail to rear and pull at their tethers. The bullet struck Bailey in the torso. The impact stopped Bailey's draw instantly. He jerked backward as if pulled by an invisible rope, but he did not fall immediately. He stood there, a look of shock replacing the anger on his face. He looked down at his chest, his hands moving toward the wound. McCluskey did not wait to see if the first shot was sufficient. He cocked the hammer again, the mechanical click audible in the silence that followed the gunshot. He adjusted his aim slightly and fired a second time. The second bullet hit Bailey with the same brutal force. This time, the Texan's legs gave way. He crumbled into the dust, his knees hitting the ground first, followed by his torso. He fell onto his side, curling up instinctively against the pain. His gun, which he had never managed to fully raise, fell from his hand and lay useless in the dirt a few feet away. The dust settled around him, staining his clothes. 2 dark patches began to spread on his shirt, the blood soaking through the fabric and dripping onto the dry earth. The silence that followed the shooting was absolute. For a few seconds, no one moved. The men on the boardwalk, the people watching from the windows, the other pedestrians on the street, everyone was frozen. They had expected a fight, perhaps even a shooting, but the reality of it was stark and horrifying. A man lay dying in the street, shot down in broad daylight. The smell of gunpowder drifted on the slight breeze, acrid, and sharp, mixing with the smell of the cattle pens. McCluskey stood over his work, his gun still in his hand, smoke curling lazily from the barrel. He lowered the weapon slowly. He looked at Bailey, then looked up at the crowd that was beginning to form. He saw the faces of the other Texans, the drovers who had been drinking with Bailey. He saw the shock turn to realization, and the realization turned to hatred. He knew in that moment that the line had been crossed. This was no longer a fist fight or an election dispute. He had killed a man. He had killed a Texan. He did not holster his gun. He turned and walked away, not back into the saloon, but down the street, moving quickly. He did not run, but his pace was urgent. He headed toward the north side of the tracks, toward the territory where the town officials held sway. He knew he could not stay in Hyde Park. The retribution would be swift and it would be collective. The Texans would not see this as a fair gunfight. They would see it as a murder. Back in the street, men rushed to Bailey's side. They knelt in the dirt, heedless of the blood. One man, a friend of Bailey's named Jim Martin, lifted the wounded man's head. Bailey was conscious, but his eyes were losing focus. He gasped for air, his breath bubbling in his throat. The bullets had done catastrophic damage to his internal organs. There was nothing the men could do in the street. They called for a wagon. Someone ran to fetch a doctor, though the seasoned men in the crowd knew it was a futile gesture. They lifted Bailey carefully. He groaned, a low, pained sound that cut through the murmurs of the crowd. They carried him to the Santa Fe Hotel, the nearest place with a bed where a man could die with some dignity. They laid him on a mattress in a small room. The doctor arrived shortly after, a man with a weary face who had seen too many gunshot wounds that summer. He examined the entry wounds, probed for the bullets, and shook his head. There was nothing to be done but to administer laudanum for the pain and wait. News of the shooting spread through Newton with the speed of a grass fire. It moved from the saloons to the general stores, from the rail yard to the cattle camps. McCluskey shot Bailey. The men said, 2 shots. Bailey is done for. The town divided instantly. The respectable citizens of the north side viewed the shooting as a regrettable but perhaps necessary act of law enforcement, a dangerous ruffian put down by a peace officer. The south side, the district of the drovers, viewed it as an assassination. McCluskey knew this. He went to his boarding house on the north side. He packed a small bag with essentials, ammunition, a change of clothes, his money. He moved with frantic energy, his hands shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. He could hear the noise from the street, the shouting, the sound of men gathering. He knew he had to leave Newton. If he stayed, he would be lynched before the sun set. The jail was a wooden shack. It would not hold a mob. He made his way to the depot. A train was scheduled to leave for the east toward Florence and Topeka later that afternoon. He waited in the shadows of the freight office, avoiding the main platform where he might be recognized. Every time a door slammed or a voice was raised, he flinched, his hand going to his gun. He was a hunter who had suddenly become the prey. The vast network of Texas cowboys, thousands of them in the camps surrounding the town, would soon be looking for him. When the train finally arrived, wheezing and clanking into the station, McCluskey boarded the last car as it began to move out. He did not buy a ticket at the window. He slipped onto the rear platform and stood there, watching the buildings of Newton recede. He saw the red front saloon, the dust of the street where Bailey's blood was drying, and the dark mass of the cattle pens. He watched until the town was just a smudge of smoke on the horizon. He was alive, but he was in exile. He had fired the shots that he thought would end the trouble, but as the train picked up speed, the rhythm of the wheels seemed to tap out a warning that the trouble was only just beginning. In the room at the Santa Fe Hotel, Billy Bailey fought for his life. The afternoon dragged on. The heat in the room was stifling. Friends sat by his bedside, fanning him, wiping the sweat from his face. They spoke in whispers of vengeance. They named McCluskey. They named the town leaders who had hired him. They swore that this blood would be paid for with more blood. Bailey drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering about the election, about the fight, about home. The sun went down, casting long shadows across the prairie. The lamps were lit in the town. Usually this was the time when the music started, when the pianos began to play and the dancing began. But on the night of August 12th, the music was muted. The dance halls were somber. The shooting had cast a pall over the entertainment district. Men drank, but they drank with a purpose. They were waiting to see if Bailey would live. They were waiting to see if McCluskey would return. By late evening, it was clear that McCluskey was gone. The search parties that had gone to his room found it empty. The men at the depot confirmed a man matching his description had hopped the eastbound train. This news was met with fury by the Texans. Their target had escaped justice. The frustration mounted, searching for an outlet. If they could not have McCluskey, they would remember the town that protected him. The physical reality of the shooting remained on the street. The bloodstains were dark patches in the dirt, attracting flies even in the twilight. Men walked around them, giving the spot a wide berth, treating it as cursed ground. It was a visible reminder of the violence that lay just beneath the surface of the town's commerce. The two shots had done more than puncture a man's body. They had punctured the fragile truce that allowed Newton to function. As midnight approached, the town settled into an uneasy quiet. The only sounds were the distant lowing of the herds and the occasional cough of a sick man. In the hotel room, Bailey's breathing became shallower. The doctor had left, leaving the vigil to the drovers. They sat with their hats in their hands, their faces grim. They were young men far from home, watching one of their own die a slow, painful death. This image burned into their minds. It was an image they would carry back to the camps, an image that would fuel the conversations for the next few days. The events of August 12th had changed the dynamic of the summer. Before, the violence had been incidental, a result of drunkenness or gambling disputes. Now it was structural. It was us against them, the railhead against the trail, the North against the South. McCluskey's 2 shots had signaled the start of a war, even if the armies had not yet fully mobilized. The train carrying the gunman was miles away, disappearing into the dark Kansas night, but the echo of his gun remained in Newton, bouncing off the wooden walls of the saloons, waiting for an answer. And everyone knew, with a certainty as hard as the iron rails, that the answer would come from the barrel of a gun, August 15th, 1871. The heat in the small room at the Santa Fe Hotel had not broken for 3 days. It accumulated in the corners and radiated from the plaster walls, creating an environment that accelerated decay. On the narrow bed, Billy Bailey fought his final battle, not against a human opponent, but against the septic infection that had ravaged his abdomen since the 12th. The 2 bullets from Mike McCluskey's revolver had done their work with a cruel efficiency, perforating the intestines and inviting a slow, agonizing death that no doctor on the frontier possessed the knowledge to reverse. The smell in the room was heavy, a mixture of sweat, laudanum, and the distinct sweet odor of gangrene that signaled the end. At 10 in the morning, the labored breathing that had marked the last 24 hours of Bailey's life ceased. The silence that followed was sudden and absolute. The men who had been keeping vigil, a rotation of Texas drovers who sat in the cane-bottomed chairs with their hats in their hands, stood up. There were no prayers said in that moment, only a grim acknowledgement of the reality. One of them reached out and closed Bailey's eyes. Another pulled the sheet up over the face that was gray and wasted, a stark contrast to the flushed, angry visage that had confronted McCluskey in the street. The death of Billy Bailey was not a tragedy to these men. It was an infraction. It was a debt incurred by the town of Newton and its hired gunmen, a debt that now required collection. The news left the hotel room and moved into the streets of Newton. It did not travel as a rumor this time, but as a confirmed fact. Bailey was dead. The finality of the event shifted the mood of the town from anxious waiting to a hardened resolve. Riders mounted up at the livery stables, their horses kicking up dust as they galloped south across the tracks. They were messengers of war, carrying the word to the vast cattle camps that ringed the settlement. The camps were the true seat of power for the Texans, a sprawling mobile city of canvas and wagons where the law of the municipality held no sway. 5 miles south of the railhead, the main body of the Texas herds grazed on the sun-bleached grass. The scale of the operation was immense. Thousands of longhorn cattle dotted the prairie, their hides a patchwork of roans, brindles, and duns. The air here was filled with the sounds of the herd, the clicking of horns, the lowing of calves, and the shouts of the vaqueros and cowboys who patrolled the perimeter. It was a hard, dirty existence. The men lived in the saddle and slept on the ground. They ate beans and beef from the chuck wagons and drank coffee that was thick enough to float a horseshoe. They were bored, they were flush with pay, and they were fiercely tribal. Hugh Anderson sat in the shade of a wagon cleaning a Colt revolver. Anderson was not a common laborer. He was the son of a wealthy Texas cattle baron, a man of standing and influence in the Southern hierarchy. He was young, handsome in a rough way, and possessed a reckless streak that was amplified by his family's money. He did not have to drive the cattle himself, but he chose to live the life, enjoying the freedom and the violence of the trail. He was a natural leader among the drovers, his charisma drawing men to him. When he spoke, the others listened. The rider from town approached the camp at a gallop, pulling his horse up sharply near the wagon where Anderson sat. The horse was lathered in sweat, its sides heaving. The rider did not dismount. He looked down at Anderson and delivered the message with a flat, unemotional delivery. Bailey had died the next day. The town was quiet. McCluskey was still gone. Anderson did not look up immediately. He finished wiping the cylinder of his revolver with an oiled rag, checking the action one last time. Then he slid the gun into his holster and stood up. The other men in the camp had stopped their work. They gathered around, a silent circle of dusty faces and worn clothing. They looked to Anderson for the reaction. The death of a drover was common enough. Stampedes, river crossings, and disease took their toll. But to be shot down by a Yankee policeman was different. It was a challenge to their collective honor. Anderson looked at the men surrounding him. He saw Billy Garrett, a man known for his steady nerves and quick temper. He saw Henry Kearns, a massive figure who used his size to intimidate. He saw Jim Wilkerson, a quiet man who was deadly with a knife or a gun. These were men who had ridden together, fought together, and survived the trail together. Anderson spoke to them in a voice that carried over the wind. He stated that the death of Bailey would not go unanswered. He declared that Newton had taken one of their own, and in return they would take the town apart if necessary, to find the man responsible. The vow was not written on parchment or sworn on a Bible. It was made in the harsh sunlight of the Kansas prairie, sealed with a nod and the checking of weapons. Anderson stated that they would wait. They would not ride into town and burn it down immediately, for that would bring the U.S. cavalry from Fort Riley. Instead, they would wait for McCluskey. Anderson knew men like McCluskey. He knew that a man who lived by the gun could not stay away from the action for long. McCluskey would return. He would think the anger had faded. He would think he was safe. And when he did, the Texans would be waiting. The decision was made to maintain a presence in town, to watch the trains and the saloons. They would rotate men in and out of Hyde Park, drinking, gambling, and listening. They would be the eyes of the Vengeance Pact. Anderson sent the rider back to town with instructions. Find out where McCluskey went. Find out when he was coming back. Pay the bartenders, pay the whores, pay the street urchins, pay anyone who could provide information. The vast resources of the cattle money were now directed toward a single manhunt. While the Texans plotted in the dust, Mike McCluskey was in Topeka, over 100 miles to the east. He had arrived there the day after the shooting, seeking refuge in the anonymity of the larger city. But the city did not suit him. Topeka was a place of politicians and lawyers, of paved streets and brick buildings. It lacked the raw energy of the railhead. McCluskey sat in a hotel room that was cleaner than anything in Newton but felt like a prison. He paced the floor, smoking cigars and drinking whiskey that tasted too smooth. He felt the pull of Newton. It was a gravitational force. His job was there. His reputation was there. To stay away was to admit fear, to admit that he had been run out of town by a group of Southern cowboys. McCluskey was a man of pride, and that pride was currently warring with his survival instinct. He rationalized the situation. He told himself that he was a duly appointed officer of the peace. He had shot Bailey in self-defense. The man had reached for a gun. Witnesses had seen it. The law was on his side. He went to the telegraph office on Kansas Avenue. He sent inquiries to his contacts in Newton, asking for the status of the town. The replies that came back were guarded. The town was quiet, they said. The Texans were angry, yes, but there had been no riots. Business was continuing. The trains were running. McCluskey read these messages and interpreted them through the lens of his own desires. He saw quiet and read safe. He saw business as usual and read, "You are needed." On the afternoon of August 15th, just hours after Bailey had breathed his last, McCluskey made the fatal decision. He checked out of the hotel in Topeka. He walked to the train station, his boots sounding confident on the platform. He purchased a ticket for the westbound train, the one that would take him back to the very place where a bounty had effectively been placed on his head. He believed he could manage the situation. He believed that his presence, his physical strength, and his badge would cow the Texans into submission. He had beaten Bailey with his fists, and then with his gun. Surely the others would take the hint. The train ride west was a journey into the furnace. As the locomotive chugged away from the river valley and onto the high plains, the air grew hotter and drier. McCluskey watched the landscape pass through the soot-stained glass. He saw the farms give way to open range. He saw the small settlements that clung to the tracks like barnacles. With every mile, he was moving closer to the men who had sworn to kill him. He cleaned his revolver again, a nervous habit that he could not suppress. He checked the load, 6 cartridges in the cylinder. He spun it, listening to the smooth mechanical whir. Back in Newton, the sun began to set on the day of Bailey's death. The undertaker had collected the body from the hotel. A simple pine box was procured. There would be no grand funeral, no parade. Bailey would be buried in the rocky soil of the Boot Hill Cemetery, just another casualty of the cattle season. But the lack of ceremony did not diminish the anger of his friends. In the saloons of Hyde Park, the talk was low and vicious. The name McCluskey was spoken with a venom that silenced the room. Anderson rode into town that evening. He did not come to drink. He came to inspect the battlefield. He walked the length of the street where the shooting had happened. He looked at the dust where Bailey had fallen. He stood outside the Red Front, looking in at the bar where the fistfight had started. He was memorizing the terrain. He was calculating angles and distances. He was a general surveying the ground before the engagement. He wore a long duster coat that concealed his weapons, but his walk announced his intent. The locals gave him a wide berth. They knew who he was and they knew what he represented. The town of Newton was caught in a suspended state. The respectable citizens on the north side hoped the violence was over. They hoped Bailey's death would close the chapter. They wanted to believe that the drovers would mourn and move on. They were willfully blind to the code of the West that demanded blood for blood. They focused on their ledgers and their land sales, ignoring the storm clouds gathering south of the tracks. As the night deepened, the train carrying McCluskey crossed the county line. The whistle blew, a lonely sound in the darkness. McCluskey leaned his head against the window, watching the sparks from the engine fly past in the dark. He was tired of running. He was tired of looking over his shoulder. He wanted to sleep in his own bed. He wanted to walk his beat and remind everyone that he was the law in Newton. He convinced himself that the Texans were all bluster, that they would not dare attack a police officer in the center of town. He was wrong. He did not understand the nature of the vow that Anderson and the others had taken. It was not a matter of courage or daring. It was a matter of obligation. They had to kill him. If they did not, they would lose face before the entire fraternity of the trail. They would be seen as weak, as men who let a Yankee kill their friend without consequence. For Hugh Anderson, this was unacceptable. The honor of Texas was at stake, and Mike McCluskey was the sacrifice required to restore it. The train slowed as it approached Newton. The brakes squealed, metal grinding on metal. McCluskey stood up and grabbed his bag. He adjusted his hat. He stepped out onto the platform as the train hissed to a halt. The air of Newton hit him, smelling of cattle and coal smoke. It was the smell of home in a twisted way. He looked around the platform. It was late, and the crowd was thin. No one shouted his name. No shots rang out. He smiled grimly. He had been right, he thought. The town was quiet. He walked from the station into the shadows of the street. He did not go to the south side immediately. He went to his boarding house, letting himself in quietly. He set his bag down and sat on the edge of his bed. He was back. He had called the bluff of the drovers, or so he believed. He undressed and lay down, the pistol within easy reach on the nightstand. Outside, the crickets chirped, and the distant piano music from Hyde Park drifted on the wind. But in the camps 5 miles away, the fires were burning low. The men were not sleeping. They were cleaning their weapons. They were sharpening their knives. Anderson sat by the fire, staring into the coals. He knew McCluskey would return. He felt it, and he was patient. The season was not over yet. There were still days left in August. There was still time to dance. The return of McCluskey was the catalyst, the chemical mixture of Newton needed to explode. His presence in the town was an affront to the mourners of Billy Bailey. It was a provocation that could not be ignored. By coming back, McCluskey had signed his own death warrant and perhaps the warrants of others who would be caught in the crossfire. The stage was set. The actors were in place. The vow of the drovers hung over the town like a suspended blade, waiting for the moment to drop. The 15th of August ended as it had begun, in heat and silence. But it was a deceptive silence. It was the silence of a fuse burning down toward a keg of powder. The death of Bailey had removed the last constraint on the Texans. They were no longer bound by the rules of the town. They were operating under their own law now, the ancient law of retribution. And as the moon rose over the prairie, it illuminated a landscape that was ready for war. August 19th, 1871. Saturday arrived in Newton with a weight that pressed down on the corrugated tin roofs and the canvas awnings of the business district. The heat of the day lingered long after the sun had dipped below the western horizon, retained by the dry earth and the wooden structures that comprised the town. This was the peak of the cattle season, the weekend where the commerce of vice reached its absolute zenith. The drovers had been paid. The herds were grazing on the flats, and the town was bracing itself for the influx of thousands of men seeking release from the monotony of the trail. The air smelled of cattle dung, coal smoke, and the anticipation of violence. Perry Tuttle's dance hall stood at the center of this nocturnal ecosystem in Hyde Park. It was a large, barn-like structure hastily constructed to maximize floor space for the crowds. The exterior was rough, unpainted lumber that had weathered to a dull gray under the Kansas sun. A crude sign hung above the entrance, illuminated by a lantern that swung in the hot breeze. Inside, the hall was a cavern of noise and heat. The ceiling was low, trapping the smoke from hundreds of cigars and pipes in a dense blue-gray cloud that hovered just above the heads of the patrons. The ventilation was non-existent save for the open front doors and a few windows that were propped open with sticks, allowing only the exchange of hot air for hot air. The interior layout was designed for two purposes: drinking and gambling. A long bar ran down one side of the room, polished smooth by the elbows of countless cowboys. Behind it, a mirror reflected the chaotic scene, though the glass was often obscured by grime and smoke. The shelves were stocked with bottles of whiskey, brandy, and gin, the labels peeling in the humidity. Bartenders worked with mechanical efficiency, pouring drinks, sliding glasses, and sweeping coins into cash drawers that rang constantly. They were men chosen for their size and their ability to handle a bung starter as well as a bottle. Opposite the bar were the gambling tables. This was the heart of the operation. Green baize cloth covered the tables, stained with spills and ash. The games were faro, monte, and poker, with faro being the undisputed king of the western frontier. Men crowded around the layouts, placing their bets on the cards depicted on the table. The dealers sat on high stools, their faces impassive, their hands moving with the dexterity of magicians as they slid cards from the dealing boxes. The click of the abacus-like case keepers used to track the cards already played provided a rhythmic percussion that cut through the din of conversation. In the center of the room was the dance floor. This was the domain of the women employed by the house. They wore dresses of brightly colored satin and silk, gaudy fabrics that caught the light of the kerosene lamps suspended from the rafters. Their faces were painted with rouge and powder, a mask to hide the fatigue of their profession. They grabbed partners from the crowd, spinning them around the sawdust-covered floor to the music provided by a small band. The musicians, a pianist and a fiddler, played with a frantic energy, trying to be heard over the shouting and the stomping of boots. The music was loud, discordant, and relentless. Mike McCluskey entered this environment shortly after 9 in the evening. His return to Newton was now public knowledge, and his presence in the dance hall was a deliberate statement. He was dressed in a dark suit, the coat tailored to conceal the bulk of the 2 revolvers he carried. He walked with a heavy, deliberate step, his eyes scanning the room as he moved. He knew he was a target. The death of Billy Bailey was fresh in the minds of every Texan in the room. Conversations stopped as he passed. Heads turned to track his progress. The silence that followed him was a localized phenomenon, a bubble of tension that moved through the crowd. He did not go to the bar. He went straight to the gambling area, selecting a seat at a faro table near the rear of the hall. This position offered him a view of the front entrance while putting a solid wall behind his back. It was a strategic choice. He sat down, placing his hat on the table next to his chips. He greeted the dealer by name, his voice steady. He ordered a drink, a whiskey, and when it arrived, he took a slow sip, his eyes never resting on one spot for long. He was projecting an image of normalcy, of a man who had every right to be there. The room was filling up rapidly. The population of Hyde Park on a Saturday night could swell to over 1,000 men, and a significant portion of them found their way to Perry's. They were young men, mostly in their 20s, lean from the trail and flush with cash. They wore the uniform of the drover, heavy wool trousers, vests, and high-heeled boots that added inches to their height. Their spurs jingled with every step, a metallic chorus that underlaid the music. Most of them were armed. While the town had ordinances against carrying weapons, enforcement was selective and often impossible in a crowd of this size. Revolvers were tucked into waistbands, hidden under coats, or worn openly in defiance of the regulations. Among the staff moving through the crowd was a young man named James Riley. He was 18 years old, but his physical condition made him appear younger and older at the same time. He was thin, his frame wasted by the early stages of tuberculosis, a disease that was slowly consuming his lungs. His skin was pale, a stark contrast to the sun-darkened faces of the cowboys. He worked as a general roustabout for Tuttle, sweeping the floors, collecting empty glasses, and running errands. To the patrons of the dance hall, he was invisible. He was part of the furniture, a weakling who warranted no attention in a world that valued physical strength. Riley had a deep, unspoken loyalty to Mike McCluskey. In a town where kindness was a rare commodity, McCluskey had treated the boy with a measure of decency. He had perhaps bought him a meal or protected him from the casual cruelty of a drunk drover. This bond went unnoticed by the Texans. They saw McCluskey as a brute and a killer. They did not see the man who had befriended the dying boy. Riley moved around the faro table where McCluskey sat, clearing away used glasses and wiping the surface. He stayed close, his eyes darting around the room, watching the faces of the men who looked at McCluskey with hatred. As the night deepened, the temperature in the hall rose. The body heat of hundreds of people combined with the kerosene lamps to create a stifling atmosphere. Sweat ran down the faces of the gamblers and the dancers. Men removed their coats, revealing their weapons. The smell of unwashed bodies became pungent, mixing with the cheap perfume of the dance hall girls and the acrid smoke. The noise level increased, a roar of voices shouting bets, ordering drinks, and laughing. It was a chaotic sensory overload that dulled the senses and shortened tempers. McCluskey played his cards methodically. He was winning small amounts, losing small amounts, the stack of chips in front of him remaining relatively constant. He was not there to get rich. He was there to occupy space. Every minute he sat at that table was a minute he proved he was not afraid. Friends approached him periodically, leaning in to whisper warnings. They told him there were rumors of a hit. They told him the Texans were gathering at other saloons, drinking themselves into a killing rage. They urged him to leave, to go back to the north side, to get on a train. McCluskey waved them away. He told them he would not be driven from his home by a mob. He was the law, or at least he had been, and he refused to act like a fugitive. His stubbornness was a mix of pride and fatalism. He knew the odds were against him, but he had lived by the gun his entire adult life. He believed he could handle whatever came through the door. He checked his weapon surreptitiously, feeling the familiar weight of the steel against his ribs. Around 10 o'clock, the atmosphere in the hall shifted slightly. A group of Texans entered, men known to be associates of the late Billy Bailey. They did not dance or gamble. They stood at the bar, drinking heavily and staring at the back of the room where McCluskey sat. They were the scouts, the advance guard. They were waiting for their leaders. They spoke in low tones, their hands hovering near their belts. The other patrons, sensing the hostility, began to give the area around the faro table a wider berth. A dead zone formed around McCluskey, a circle of isolation in the crowded room. Perry Tuttle, the owner of the establishment, watched the scene with growing anxiety. He was a businessman. A shootout in his hall was bad for business. It broke mirrors, put holes in the walls, and scared away the paying customers. He approached McCluskey, asking him quietly if he wouldn't prefer to call it a night. McCluskey looked at Tuttle with cold eyes and ordered another whiskey. Tuttle retreated, signaling his bartenders to keep the bottles moving but to be ready to duck. The music played on, a bizarre soundtrack to the mounting tension. The pianist hammered out a lively reel while the fiddler sawed at his instrument. Couples spun around the floor, oblivious or indifferent to the drama unfolding in the corner. The floorboards vibrated with the rhythm of the boots. Dust rose from the cracks between the planks, adding grit to the air. James Riley stopped his work. He stood in the shadows near a side door, his broom held like a staff. He was coughing softly into a rag, his chest heaving with the effort. He watched the Texans at the bar. He memorized their faces. He saw the way they looked at McCluskey. He saw them checking the loads in their revolvers. The boy was underestimated by everyone in the room. He was frail, yes, but he was armed. He carried 2 revolvers of his own, heavy weapons that looked too large for his thin hands. He kept them concealed, waiting. He had decided that if the Texans came for McCluskey, they would have to go through him. Midnight approached, the witching hour in a cow town. This was when the serious drinking turned into serious trouble. The casual visitors began to drift away, leaving the hard core of drinkers and gamblers. The noise level dropped slightly, losing the frantic edge of the early evening and taking on a darker, more menacing tone. The laughter became harsher. The arguments over cards became sharper. McCluskey remained in his chair. He was tired. The adrenaline that had sustained him earlier was fading, replaced by a grim endurance. He watched the cards turn: king, queen, ace. He placed his bets mechanically. He was waiting. He knew they were coming. It was just a question of when. He could feel the eyes on him, dozens of them, weighing him, measuring him for a coffin. The layout of the room became a tactical map in McCluskey's mind. The front door was too far away. He would never make it if shooting started. The back door was locked and barred. His only cover was the table he sat at and the wall behind him. He positioned his chair so his right arm was free, his gun hand unobstructed. He mentally calculated the time it would take to draw and fire. He identified the primary threats at the bar. He was running scenarios, preparing for the violence he had courted by returning. The air in the hall seemed to thicken, heavy with the moisture of breath and the impending storm. The lamps flickered as the oil burned low, casting long, jumping shadows on the walls. The faces of the men in the room looked distorted in the dim light, grotesque masks of greed and anger. At the bar, the Texans finished their drinks. They did not order another round. They turned from the bar, facing the room. They were not attacking yet. They were waiting for a signal, for a person. They checked their pocket watches. The timing was coordinated. This was not going to be a random brawl, it was an execution. Perry Tuttle wiped a glass with a dirty rag, his eyes darting between the Texans and McCluskey. He wished he were anywhere else. He wished he had closed early. But greed had kept the doors open, and now the bill was coming due. He signaled the piano player to keep playing, hoping the music would somehow diffuse the situation. But the notes sounded tinny and weak against the silence that was growing in the hearts of the men. McCluskey took a final sip of his whiskey. It was warm and tasted of copper. He set the glass down on the green baize. He looked at the dealer. The dealer looked back, his face pale. The dealer knew. Everyone knew. The game was effectively over, even if the cards were still being turned. The real gamble was no longer on the turn of a card, but on who would walk out of the hall alive. James Riley stepped out of the shadows. He moved closer to McCluskey's table, positioning himself near a support pillar. He did not speak to McCluskey. He just stood there, a silent sentinel, a ghost, before he was dead. His presence was the only variable the Texans had not calculated. They saw a sick boy. They did not see the shadow of death standing at the policeman's shoulder. Saturday night at Perry's was coming to its conclusion. The day of August 19th bled into the 20th. The calendar turned, bringing with it the Sabbath, a day of rest. But there would be no rest in Newton this morning. The stage was fully set. The actors were in position. The audience was trapped in the theater. All that was missing was the leading man of the opposition, and he was on his way. August 20th, 1871, 1 a.m. The clock on the wall behind the bar at Perry Tuttle's dance hall ticked past the hour, marking the official transition from the rowdy excesses of Saturday night into the ominous silence of Sunday morning. The atmosphere in the hall had undergone a subtle chemical change. The frantic, joyous energy of the early evening had evaporated, leaving behind a residue of exhaustion and sullen drunkenness. The air was thick with the smoke of 1,000 cigarettes and cigars, creating a haze that hung low over the heads of the remaining patrons. It was a blue-gray fog that stung the eyes and coated the back of the throat with the taste of burnt tobacco. The heat, which had been oppressive all day, had not lifted with the darkness. Instead, it seemed to have concentrated inside the wooden walls of the building, radiated by the press of bodies and the burning oil lamps. Through the open double doors at the front of the hall, the night air of the prairie drifted in. But it offered no relief. It only brought the smell of the cattle pens and the dry dust of the street. It was into this heavy, stagnating environment that the vanguard of the Texas Revenge Party made their entrance. They did not burst in with guns drawn and shouting. That would have been amateurish, a waste of the element of surprise. Instead, they entered with a chilling casualness that was far more terrifying to those who knew to look for it. Billy Garrett was the first to cross the threshold. He was a man well known in the camps for a temper that could flare as quickly as a match strike, but tonight he was composed. He walked with a slow, rolling gait, his spurs dragging slightly on the wooden floorboards. He was dressed in the work clothes of a drover, but he had taken care to ensure his coat was loose enough to clear the handle of the revolver at his hip. He stopped just inside the door, his eyes adjusting to the dim light of the interior. He scanned the room, ignoring the dancers and the drinkers, his gaze moving methodically until it locked onto the figure of Mike McCluskey sitting at the faro table in the back. Garrett did not smile. He did not frown. He simply noted the position of his target, cataloging the distance and the obstacles between them. Following close behind Garrett was Henry Kearns. Kearns was a physical contrast to Garrett, a larger, heavier man whose sheer bulk was a weapon in itself. He moved with the heavy tread of a draft horse, his boots thudding solidly against the planks. Kearns had a reputation as a brawler, a man who enjoyed the physical contact of a fight. His face was set in a mask of grim determination. He did not look at the women in the gaudy dresses or the gamblers at the tables. His focus was entirely on the tactical layout of the room. He moved to the left, securing a position that covered the side of the room, effectively cutting off one avenue of escape. He leaned his back against the rough wood of the wall, hooking his thumbs into his gun belt, a posture that looked relaxed but allowed his hands to hover inches from his weapon. The third man to enter was Jim Wilkerson. He was the quietest of the three, a man who seemed to slide into the room rather than walk into it. Wilkerson was a shadow, a presence that was felt rather than seen. He moved to the right, finding a spot near the end of the bar where the shadows were deepest. He ordered a drink with a nod of his head, his voice barely a murmur. When the glass was placed before him, he did not drink immediately. He held it in his hand, looking over the rim at the room. His eyes were cold, assessing the threats, identifying the men who might side with McCluskey and the men who would dive for cover. Wilkerson was the closer, the man who would ensure that once the shooting started, it would be finished properly. The arrival of these three men sent a ripple of awareness through the dance hall. It was not a panic but a dawning realization among the seasoned veterans of the frontier that the temperature of the room had just dropped to freezing. The local men, the railroad workers and the shopkeepers who had stayed late, began to find reasons to leave. They finished their drinks in hurried gulps. They mumbled excuses to their companions and drifted toward the exits, giving the three Texans a wide berth. The crowd began to thin, peeling away layer by layer until only the hard core remained, The gamblers, the drunks, too stupefied to notice the danger, and the men who were bound by honor or employment to stay. Mike McCluskey saw them enter. From his seat at the faro table, he had a clear view of the front door. He saw Garrett lock eyes with him. He saw Kearns take the wall. He saw Wilkerson fade into the bar. He knew exactly what this meant. This was the cordon. They were securing the perimeter, blocking the exits, and penning him in. They were not the executioners. They were the jailers. They were waiting for someone else. McCluskey did not panic. He did not jump up and overturn the table. He kept his hands on the table, visible and steady. He knew that any sudden movement now would trigger the violence prematurely, and he was outnumbered 3-1. McCluskey turned his attention back to the game, but his mind was no longer on the cards. He was calculating his odds. He had his 2 revolvers. He was a good shot. But Garrett, Kearns, and Wilkerson were also armed and experienced, and they were positioned in a triangulation of fire. If he stood up to shoot at Garrett, Kearns would have a clear shot at his side. If he turned to Kearns, Wilkerson would take him from the bar. It was a tactical checkmate. His only hope was to wait, to see if an opening presented itself, or to take as many of them with him as he could when the end came. The music from the piano and the fiddle continued, but the tune seemed to have lost its rhythm. The musicians played mechanically, their eyes darting toward the Texans. They knew the reputation of these men. They knew that when the Texas drovers gathered like this, without shouting and without laughing, blood was going to be spilled. The piano player hit a sour note, his fingers slipping on the keys from sweat and nervousness. He corrected himself quickly, keeping the melody going, afraid that silence would be the signal for the guns to start talking. Garrett moved to the bar, standing a few feet away from Wilkerson but not acknowledging him. He ordered a whiskey. The bartender, a man named Carlos, poured the drink with a shaking hand. The bottle clinked against the glass, a sharp sound in the quiet space near the bar. Garrett looked at the bartender, his eyes flat and devoid of empathy. He tossed a coin onto the wood. It spun for a moment before settling. Garrett lifted the glass and downed the contents in one swallow. He did not grimace. He set the glass down hard. He turned his back to the bar, facing the room, facing McCluskey. The psychological pressure in the room was immense. It was a physical weight pressing down on the chest. The air felt too thin to breathe. Every sound was amplified. The clinking of chips at the faro table sounded like stones falling into a well. The shuffle of the cards sounded like dry leaves scraping on pavement. A cough from across the room sounded like a gunshot. The men at the table spoke in whispers, if they spoke at all. They placed their bets tentatively, their eyes fixed on the layout, but their attention fixed on the 3 men standing guard. Henry Kearns took a plug of tobacco from his vest pocket. He bit off a piece and began to chew slowly. He spat a stream of dark juice onto the floor, narrowly missing the boot of a man standing near him. The man looked up, saw Kearns's face, and quickly moved away. Kearns did not apologize. He did not even acknowledge the man's existence. He was a statue of menace, carved from muscle and bad intentions. He watched the door and he watched McCluskey. He was checking the street outside, ensuring that no reinforcements for the policemen were arriving. James Riley, the young consumptive, remained in the shadows near the rear of the hall. He had seen the Texans enter. He recognized them as the associates of Hugh Anderson. He knew that their presence meant Anderson was close behind. Riley's hand went to the pocket of his trousers, touching the cold metal of the pistol he carried there. He was trembling, but not from fear. It was the tremors of his illness combined with a surge of adrenaline. He was the wild card in this deck. The Texans had accounted for McCluskey. They had accounted for the exits. They had accounted for the crowd. But they had not accounted for the dying boy with the dual revolvers who was watching them with the intensity of a hawk. The minutes dragged by. 1:10, 1:15. The wait was a deliberate tactic. It was designed to fray McCluskey's nerves, to make him sweat, to make him doubt himself. The Texans were comfortable in the silence. They had spent months on the trail where silence was the norm. They knew how to wait. McCluskey, a town man, a man of action, found the waiting harder. He could feel the sweat trickling down his spine, soaking his shirt. He could feel the itch in his palms. He wanted to scream at them, to draw, to get it over with. But he held his tongue. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Garrett signaled for another drink. He did not turn around. He simply held his glass up over his shoulder. The bartender hurried to fill it. Garrett brought the glass to his lips, sipping it slowly this time. He was pacing himself. He needed his hands steady. He needed his mind clear. He was the field commander until Anderson arrived. He watched the other patrons in the bar. A group of railroad workers were huddled in a corner, whispering. Garrett caught the eye of one of them and stared him down until the man looked away. Dominance was being established without a word being spoken. The dance floor was empty now. The women had retreated to the sides of the room, fanning themselves nervously. They whispered among themselves, their painted faces showing lines of worry. They had seen violence in Hyde Park before, but this felt different. This was organized. This was heavy. They looked at McCluskey with pity. They knew he was a dead man walking. They looked at the Texans with fear. They knew that stray bullets did not discriminate between a gunman and a dance hall girl. Jim Wilkerson shifted his position slightly. He moved away from the bar, creating a wider angle of fire. He checked the load of his pistol by feel, running his thumb over the cylinder. He was ready. He looked across the room at Kearns. Kearns nodded imperceptibly. The trap was set. The net was drawn tight. There was no way out for McCluskey now. If he tried to run for the back door, Kearns would cut him down. If he charged the front, Garrett and Wilkerson would crossfire him. If he stayed put, he was a sitting duck. McCluskey reached for his glass of whiskey. His hand was steady, a testament to his iron will. He took a drink, letting the liquid coat his mouth. He set the glass down. He looked directly at Garrett. He did not blink. It was a challenge. He was telling them that he was still there, that he was still dangerous. Garrett returned the look with a sneer. The silent conversation between the hunter and the prey was loud in the quiet room. Outside, the sound of horses approaching could be heard. It was not a gallop, but a steady trot. The sound grew louder, distinct against the background noise of the night. The Texans in the hall stiffened. They knew that sound. It was the arrival they had been waiting for. Kearns pushed himself off the wall. Wilkerson stepped away from the bar. Garrett turned fully toward the door. The pieces were all on the board now. The game was entering its final phase. The patrons in the hall heard the horses, too. They stopped talking completely. The silence was absolute. The only sound was the wheezing of the accordion player who had forgotten to stop squeezing his instrument. The air seemed to vibrate with anticipation. The door was an open mouth, waiting to swallow the night. Every eye was fixed on that rectangle of darkness. McCluskey shifted in his chair. He unbuttoned his coat. He moved his right leg back, bracing himself to stand or to drop. He knew who was coming. He knew that the time for waiting was over. The arrival of the vanguard had been the preamble. The main event was walking up the steps of the boardwalk. The three Texans, Garrett, Kearns, and Wilkerson, formed a loose triangle near the entrance. They were the honor guard for the vengeance that was about to walk through the door. They were the anvil. Hugh Anderson would be the hammer, and Mike McCluskey was the steel that was about to be struck. James Riley took a step forward from the shadows. He moved silently, his boots making no sound on the sawdust. He positioned himself where he had a clear line of sight to the door and to the Texans. He breathed in, a shallow, rattling breath. He steadied himself against a pillar. He was ready. He was the only one in the room who had not been factored into the Texans' equation. And in the bloody arithmetic of the frontier, an unknown variable was the most dangerous thing of all. 1:30 a.m. The horses stopped outside. The sound of boots hitting the wooden boardwalk echoed into the hall. Heavy, deliberate steps, spurs jingling. The doorframe was filled by a shadow, the shadow of a man. The Texans inside the hall did not reach for their guns yet. They waited. They let the tension stretch until it was a thin, high wire screaming to be snapped. The man in the doorway paused. He looked at Garrett. He looked at Kearns. He looked at Wilkerson. He saw that the room was secure. He saw that the trap was laid. He saw his target sitting in the back alone and defiant. He stepped into the light. The wait was over. The gathering was complete. The execution could now proceed. The dance hall, which had been a place of revelry and vice, was now a courtroom and an execution chamber. The judge had arrived. The jury was armed and waiting. The accused sat in his chair, his hand near his gun, his face a mask of stone. The air was so still that the dust motes seemed suspended in time, hanging in the golden light of the lamps, waiting for the concussion of gunpowder to scatter them. Billy Garrett took one last drink. He set the glass on a nearby table. He wiped his mouth with the back of his gloved hand. He rolled his shoulders, loosening the muscles. He looked at McCluskey one last time, a look that said, "It is time." The gathering of the Texans was not just a show of force. It was a ritual of blood and honor that demanded a sacrifice. And the altar was prepared. At 2 a.m., Hugh Anderson stepped fully into the light of Perry Tuttle's dance hall. His presence commanded the immediate attention of every soul within the wooden structure. He was not a large man in the way that Mike McCluskey was large, nor did he possess the brute, bearish physicality of Henry Kearns. Anderson carried himself with the lithe, coiled grace of a predator. He was the son of a wealthy Texas family, and his attire reflected a status that was elevated above the common drover. He wore a long linen duster that fell past his knees, a garment chosen as much for its ability to conceal weapons as for its protection against the dust of the trail. Beneath the coat, his clothing was tailored, his boots polished despite the grit of the street. But it was his face that froze the room. His expression was devoid of the drunken rage that usually fueled barroom brawls. It was cold, precise, and entirely sober. Anderson paused just inside the threshold, allowing his eyes to adjust to the smoky haze of the interior. The smell of the room was a physical assault, stale beer, unwashed bodies, and the sharp sulfuric tang of coal oil lamps. To Anderson, these scents were irrelevant. His focus was singular. He looked across the expanse of the floor, past the frozen dancers and the silent musicians, directly to the faro table in the rear corner. There sat Mike McCluskey. The distance between them was perhaps 30 feet, a gauntlet of sawdust and tension that Anderson intended to cross with deliberate speed. The silence that had begun with the arrival of the vanguard now deepened into a vacuum. The piano player, who had been nervously fingering the keys, finally stopped, leaving a sudden acoustic void that rang in the ears of the patrons. The only sounds remaining were the creaking of floorboards and the heavy rhythmic thud of Anderson's boots as he began his walk. He moved down the center of the room. The crowd parted before him like water around the prow of a ship. Men scrambled to get out of his path, overturning chairs and spilling drinks in their haste to reach the perceived safety of the walls. No one wanted to be in the line of fire. They knew with an instinct honed by life on the frontier that the space between Anderson and McCluskey was now a kill zone. As Anderson advanced, his lieutenants held their positions. Billy Garrett, standing near the bar, shifted his weight, his hand resting openly on the grip of his revolver. He watched the room, ensuring that no friend of McCluskey made a move to intervene. Henry Kearns, the massive wall of a man, scanned the crowd with a menacing glare, daring anyone to step forward. Jim Wilkerson, the shadow in the corner, remained motionless, his presence a silent threat to the flank. They had secured the arena. Anderson was free to conduct his business without interference. McCluskey watched Anderson approach. He did not rise immediately. To stand too early would be a sign of nervousness. He remained, seated, his hands resting on the green baize of the table. His face was pale, the blood having drained away under the immense pressure of the moment, but his eyes were steady. He knew this was the end of the chase. There were no trains to catch, no cities to hide in. The feud that had started with a fist fight and escalated with 2 shots in the street had now come to his table. He moved his right hand slowly, inching it closer to the revolver tucked into his waistband. He calculated the seconds. Anderson was 20 feet away, 15 feet, 10. When Anderson reached a point roughly 10 feet from the table, he stopped. He stood with his feet shoulder-width apart, a stable firing stance. He looked down at McCluskey with a mixture of contempt and triumph. The air between them was electric. Anderson spoke first, his voice loud enough to be heard in every corner of the silent hall. He did not whisper. He projected his words with the clarity of a courtroom sentence. He called McCluskey a coward. He accused him of murdering Billy Bailey in cold blood. He cursed him using language that was foul and direct, designed to strip away any veneer of authority McCluskey might still cling to. McCluskey pushed his chair back. The legs of the chair scraped loudly against the wood floor, a harsh sound that made several people flinch. He stood up slowly, rising to his full height. He faced Anderson, his chest heaving slightly. He replied that he was no coward. He stated that he had done his duty. The words were brave, but they were hollow against the reality of the gun barrel that was now rising to meet him. Anderson did not wait for McCluskey to finish his defense. The time for talking had expired. With a movement that was blurred by its speed, Anderson swept back the side of his duster and drew his pistol. It was a single-action revolver, a heavy piece of iron that he handled with practiced ease. He did not fire from the hip. He raised the weapon, extending his arm fully to acquire a sight picture. The target was large, McCluskey's torso. McCluskey reacted instantly. He snatched his own pistol from his waistband. It was a desperate race, a contest of milliseconds. McCluskey was fast, but Anderson had the advantage of initiative. Anderson's finger tightened on the trigger. The hammer fell. The first shot was deafening. In the confined space of the dance hall, the report of the large-caliber revolver sounded like a cannon blast. The concussion shook the dust from the rafters. A tongue of orange flame erupted from the barrel of Anderson's gun, illuminating the dim room for a split second. The bullet bridged the gap between the 2 men faster than thought. It struck McCluskey in the neck just above the collarbone. The impact was brutal. The heavy lead slug tore through muscle and tissue, shattering the clavicle and severing arteries. McCluskey was spun around by the force of the blow. A spray of bright red arterial blood erupted from the wound, painting the green felt of the faro table and splattering the shirt of the dealer who had thrown himself to the floor. McCluskey staggered backward, his boots slipping on the sawdust. The shock of the impact disrupted his nervous system, sending a jolt of agony through his body that nearly caused him to drop his weapon. But McCluskey did not fall. Fueled by a final surge of adrenaline and the survival instinct of a man who had lived a violent life, he fought to stay upright. He righted himself, swaying drunkenly. He raised his own revolver, leveling it at Anderson through the cloud of sulphurous smoke that now hung between them. His vision was graying at the edges, his body rapidly losing blood pressure. But he could still see the shape of his killer. He cocked the hammer of his gun, The mechanical click was audible to those nearby. Anderson stood his ground. He did not dive for cover. He watched McCluskey with a cold detachment, waiting to see if the man had any fight left. He prepared to fire again, cocking his own weapon. McCluskey squeezed the trigger. There was a sharp snap, the sound of the hammer striking the percussion cap. But there was no explosion, no recoil, no bullet. The cartridge had misfired. Whether due to a faulty primer, damp powder, or a mechanical failure within the cylinder, the weapon had failed at the critical moment. It was a sound more horrifying to a gunman than the boom of a cannon, the sound of a click when there should have been a bang. McCluskey looked at his gun in disbelief. The horror of the malfunction registered on his face, overriding the pain of his wound. He tried to cock the hammer again, his thumb slipping on the metal which was now slick with his own blood. He was a dead man, and the tool of his salvation had become a useless weight of steel in his hand. Anderson saw the failure. He saw the desperation. He showed no mercy. He adjusted his aim, lowering the barrel slightly to ensure the kill. He fired a second time. The second bullet struck McCluskey in the torso, punching through his chest. The force of this second impact finished what the first had started. McCluskey's legs buckled completely. He collapsed backward, crashing onto the floor with a heavy thud. He landed hard, his body twisting as he hit the planks. His pistol fell from his hand, sliding away across the sawdust. He lay on his back, staring up at the smoke-stained ceiling. His breath came in ragged, gurgling gasps as his lungs filled with blood. Anderson walked forward. He moved with the deliberation of an executioner verifying his work. He stopped directly over the fallen man. He looked down into McCluskey's eyes, which were rapidly losing their focus. The pool of blood around McCluskey's head and shoulders expanded quickly, soaking into the wood and the sawdust, turning the floor into a dark, crimson mire. The room remained suspended in a state of shock. The violence had occurred in less than 10 seconds. It had been a burst of kinetic energy that paralyzed the onlookers. The women near the walls pressed their hands over their mouths to stifle screams. The men stood frozen, their eyes locked on the tableau in the center of the room. The smell of burnt gunpowder was overwhelming now, choking the air, mixing with the metallic scent of blood. Anderson did not holster his weapon. He looked up from the body, scanning the room. He looked at the dealer cowering under the table. He looked at the bartender frozen with a bottle in his hand. He looked at the crowd. His expression was one of challenge. He had done what he came to do. He had fulfilled the vow. He had killed the man who killed Billy Bailey. In his mind, justice had been served. The ledger was balanced. But the violence of the shot had broken the seal on the room's tension. The ringing in the ears of the patrons began to fade, replaced by the sounds of reality returning. A woman screamed, a high, piercing sound that shattered the paralysis. Glass fell from a table and broke. The sound of movement began, a rustling of clothing and the scuffling of boots as people realized the danger was not over. Anderson turned to look at his men. Garrett, Kearns, and Wilkerson were still at their posts, their weapons drawn now. They had watched the execution with professional interest. They were ready to cover Anderson's exit. The plan had been simple: enter, kill the target, and leave. They assumed that with McCluskey dead, the fight was over. They assumed the town would be too cowed to retaliate. They assumed the night would end with them riding back to the camps in triumph. McCluskey made one final movement. His hand twitched, his fingers clawing feebly at the floorboards. Then he went still. The rise and fall of his chest ceased. The light left his eyes. Mike McCluskey, the night policeman of Newton, the man who had tried to impose order on Hyde Park, was dead. His body lay as a testament to the brutality of the feud. The smoke from the two shots drifted lazily toward the ceiling, forming a gray cloud that hung over the corpse like a shroud. The lamps flickered through the haze. Anderson stepped back from the body, his boots leaving bloody footprints on the floor. He began to turn toward the door, signaling to his men that it was time to withdraw. He believed the event was concluded. He believed that the one-sided duel was the finale of the drama. He was wrong. The execution of Mike McCluskey was not an ending. It was an ignition. Anderson had focused so entirely on his target that he had ignored the periphery. He had ignored the shadows. He had ignored the slight, sickly figure standing by the pillar near the rear of the hall. He had failed to account for James Riley. Riley had watched the entire sequence. He had seen his friend insulted. He had seen him shot down. He had seen the misfire. He had seen the coup de grace. He stood motionless, his face a mask of grief that was rapidly hardening into a cold, white-hot fury. He gripped the handles of his revolvers, his knuckles white. The consumptive boy who coughed blood into a rag was about to cough fire into the room. Anderson took a step toward the exit. The crowd began to murmur, a low sound of fear and confusion. The air in the dance hall was unstable, volatile. The killing had released a savage energy. The smell of blood triggered a primal response in the men present. Fear turned to panic. Anger turned to rage. Anderson's second shot, the one that had delivered the final death blow, still echoed in the corners of the room. It was a sound that marked the boundary between the targeted violence of a feud and the indiscriminate slaughter of a massacre. The dance hall, with its locked back door and its crowded floor, was a trap, and Anderson, in his arrogance, had just sprung it on himself. He looked at Garrett and nodded. Garrett holstered his gun, preparing to leave. Kearns relaxed his stance slightly. They thought the show was over. They turned their backs on the rear of the room. They turned their backs on the dead body and the boy standing next to it. It was a fatal tactical error. The blood from McCluskey's neck wound had stopped spurting and was now oozing thick and dark. It pooled around his head, a dark halo on the sawdust. The sight of it was visceral, undeniable. It was the reality of death, stripped of any romance or glory. It was just meat and fluid on a dirty floor. Anderson wiped a speck of powder residue from his cheek. He felt a surge of adrenaline, the high that comes from surviving a gunfight. He felt invincible. He had walked into the lion's den and killed the lion. He felt the weight of the eyes on him, the mixture of fear and respect. He savored it. But the silence was about to be broken again. Not by a single shot, but by a storm. The execution was complete, but the payment was yet to be collected. The young boy in the shadows raised his head. His eyes were dry, his hands were steady. He stepped away from the pillar, moving into the open space that Anderson had just vacated. He raised his arms. The narrative of the Hyde Park gunfight had reached its fulcrum. The single line of action, Anderson killing McCluskey, was finished. The focused beam of violence was about to shatter into a prism of chaos. The execution was the spark. The fuel was the room itself. And the match had just been dropped. The fear that had held him frozen against the pillar evaporated, replaced by a cold, mechanical resolution. He stepped away from the wood that had supported his frail frame. Riley moved with a sudden fluid speed that belied his consumptive condition. He walked directly to the heavy double doors at the front of the hall. The Texans, Garrett and Kearns, were standing near the bar and the wall, their attention focused inward on Anderson, congratulating him with their eyes. They did not see the boy move behind them. Riley reached the doors. He did not open them to flee. He grabbed the heavy iron bolt and slammed it home. Or perhaps he simply planted his feet and leveled his weapons, effectively sealing the exit with a wall of lead. The sound of the latch engaging or the click of his hammers was lost in the murmur of the crowd, but the visual was stark. He turned to face the room. In his hands he held 2 revolvers. They were not the small pocket pistols of a gambler. They were heavy service weapons, extensions of his rage, The first indication the Texans had that their assessment of the situation was incorrect was the sound of a hammer being cocked behind them. It was a crisp, mechanical snap that cut through the low noise of the room. Billy Garrett turned his head, a look of confusion beginning to form on his face. He saw the boy. He saw the muzzle flashes. Riley did not speak. He did not issue a challenge. He simply unleashed a torrent of violence. He squeezed the triggers of both weapons. The first shot struck Billy Garrett in the shoulder, spinning him around. The heavy lead slug shattered the clavicle and drove downward into the chest cavity. Garrett groaned a wet, gurgling sound and stumbled against the bar. His own gun, which he had been in the process of holstering, clattered uselessly against the wood. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and he slid down the front of the bar, leaving a smear of crimson on the polished wood. Henry Kearns, the giant, roared in surprise. He reached for his weapon, his large hand fumbling for the grip. Riley shifted his aim with a terrifying precision. The second and third shots rang out in rapid succession, the reports blending into a single deafening roar. One bullet struck Kearns squarely in the chest, punching through the heavy muscle and bone. The giant staggered back as if hit by a sledgehammer. He crashed into a table, splintering the wood and sending cards and chips flying into the air. He did not fall immediately. His immense strength kept him upright for a second longer, swaying like a felled oak, before gravity claimed him. Hugh Anderson, standing over McCluskey's body, spun around at the sound of the gunfire. His face, moments ago filled with arrogance, was now a mask of shock. He raised his pistol, trying to acquire a target through the rapidly thickening smoke. Riley was a ghost in the haze, a muzzle flash in the darkness. Anderson fired a shot, but it went wild, burying itself in the wall. Riley returned fire. His bullet struck Anderson in the thigh, shattering the femur. The leg gave way instantly, and the Texan leader collapsed onto the floor, landing in the same sawdust that was already soaking up the blood of his victim. He cried out, a sharp sound of agony that pierced the din. The dance hall exploded into chaos. The patrons, realizing that the targeted assassination had devolved into an indiscriminate massacre, panicked. Men and women screamed, diving for the floor or scrambling over tables to get away from the line of fire. The air was instantly filled with the acrid, biting smoke of black powder. It billowed from Riley's guns in thick white clouds, obscuring vision and burning the eyes. The lamps flickered wildly as the shockwaves from the gunfire disrupted the air pressure in the room. One lamp was struck by a stray bullet, shattering the glass and spilling burning oil onto the floor, adding the smell of charring wood to the metallic scent of blood. Riley did not stop. He was a machine. He walked forward, firing into the smoke, targeting anything that looked like a Texan. Jim Wilkerson, the third man of the vanguard, had dived behind the bar at the first shot. He popped up, firing blindly over the mahogany surface. A bullet from Riley's gun struck the mirror behind the bar, showering Wilkerson with shards of glass. Wilkerson flinched, blood streaming from cuts on his face, and fired back. His bullet struck a bystander, a railroad brakeman named Patrick Lee, who had been trying to crawl toward the door. Lee cried out and clutched his stomach, rolling onto his side in the dirt. The room was a slaughterhouse. The noise was indescribable. The booming of the heavy-caliber revolvers was amplified by the wooden walls, creating a concussive force that hammered against the eardrums. Through the smoke, muzzle flashes illuminated the terror on the faces of the crowd. People trampled one another in their desperation to find cover. A woman's dress caught on a splintered chair, and she was dragged down by the press of bodies, screaming as boots stomped on her. Riley continued to advance. He was walking toward the center of the room, stepping over the debris. He fired at Anderson again, who was trying to drag himself across the floor. Anderson returned fire from a prone position, his bullets biting into the floorboards near Riley's feet. It was a duel fought at point-blank range in a room filled with screaming civilians. Jim Martin, the Texan who had tried to act as a peacemaker during the earlier days of the feud, stood up from a table near the wall. He raised his hands, perhaps intending to call for a ceasefire, or perhaps simply trying to show he was unarmed. In the confusion and the smoke, he was just another silhouette. A bullet fired either by Riley or one of the wounded Texans struck Martin in the neck. He clutched his throat, blood spurting between his fingers, and fell forward across a table. The man who had tried to prevent the violence became one of its most tragic casualties. The sheer volume of fire was staggering. Within the span of perhaps 15 seconds, over a dozen shots were fired. The room was so thick with smoke that visibility was reduced to less than 5 feet. Riley fired until his hammers clicked on empty chambers. He dropped one gun and switched the other to his dominant hand. Or perhaps he reloaded one cylinder with the frantic dexterity of a man possessed. The details were lost in the fog. What remained was the result. Henry Kearns lay on the floor gasping for air, his chest heaving with the effort to inflate a punctured lung. Pink froth bubbled on his lips. He looked up at the ceiling, his eyes wide with the realization of his mortality. Billy Garrett was slumped against the bar, unconscious or dead, a dark pool spreading beneath him. Hugh Anderson lay near the body of McCluskey, his leg a ruin of shattered bone and torn muscle, his gun empty. Riley stood in the center of the carnage. The adrenaline that had fueled his assault was peaking, leaving him shaking. He looked around the room. The screaming had subsided into a low moaning of the wounded. The gunfire had stopped, leaving a ringing silence that was heavy with the smell of death. He was the only man standing in the center of the floor. The little shadow had cast a darkness over the room that no lamp could penetrate. The door he had blocked was now being hammered on from the outside. People in the street, attracted by the noise of the battle, were trying to get in, or perhaps trying to break the door down to let the people out. Riley looked at the door. He looked at the bodies. He realized his position. He was alone. The ammunition in his guns was spent. The adrenaline was fading, and the reality of his illness was returning. He coughed, a racking spasm that bent him double, his body expelling the smoke he had inhaled. He moved toward the side exit, a smaller door that led into the alley. He stepped over the body of a man he might have killed. He did not check the faces. He pushed the door open and stumbled out into the night. The fresh air hit him like a physical blow. He gasped, sucking in the oxygen, his lungs burning. He vanished into the darkness of the alley, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Back inside the hall, the scene was one of absolute devastation. The smoke began to lift slowly, drifting out through the shattered windows and the open side door. The survivors began to pick themselves up from the floor. They looked around with dazed expressions, unable to comprehend the speed of the violence. It had been less than a minute since Anderson had fired the fatal shot at McCluskey, but in that minute, the balance of power in Newton had been irrevocably altered. The floor of Perry Tuttle's dance hall was a landscape of horror. Blood mixed with the sawdust, creating a red mud that coated the boots of the survivors. Cards and money lay scattered among the bodies, the trivial stakes of the gambling tables ignored in the face of the higher stakes that had just been played. The piano, miraculously undamaged, stood silent in the corner, a witness to the atrocity. Doctors were called for. Men ran into the street shouting for help. The town of Newton, which had been sleeping or drinking, woke up to the reality of the massacre. Lanterns appeared in the windows of the neighboring buildings. People poured into the street, drawn by the gravity of the disaster. They crowded around the entrance of the dance hall, peering into the gloom, trying to identify the victims. Hugh Anderson was alive, but barely. Men rushed to his side, lifting him carefully. He screamed in pain as his shattered leg moved. They carried him out, his blood dripping onto the boardwalk. Kearns was too heavy to move easily. 4 men struggled to lift him. He was groaning, a deep, resonant sound of suffering. Garrett was dragged out by his boots, his body limp. The casualty list grew as the smoke cleared. Patrick Lee, the brakeman, was carried out, his face pale and clammy. Hickey, another drover who had been hit in the leg, hobbled out supported by two friends. Jim Martin's body was recovered from the table where he had fallen, his hands still clutching his neck. And in the back, the body of Mike McCluskey lay where it had fallen, the cause of the violence and its first victim. The narrative of the night had shifted from a duel to a slaughter. The Texans, who had walked in as conquerors, were being carried out as corpses. The town of Newton had been baptized in blood. The brutality of the event was not in the number of shots fired, but in the confined ferocity of the exchange. It was a reminder that in the West there was no such thing as a spectator. When the guns came out, everyone was a target. The specific injuries were gruesome. The large caliber bullets used by both sides, likely 44 or 36 caliber, did not just puncture, they smashed. Bones were pulverized, organs were ruptured. The medical knowledge of the time was primitive. A gut shot was a death sentence, and a shattered femur meant amputation or a lifetime of crippling pain. The doctors who arrived at the scene were faced with a battlefield triage situation in a dance hall. The mystery of James Riley began to take shape immediately. Who was he? Where had he gone? The survivors whispered his name. They spoke of the boy who had turned into a demon. They spoke of the way he had locked the door. They spoke of the two guns. The legend of the Shadow was being born in the blood of the men he had shot. He had not said a word. He had not made a demand. He had simply executed a counter-ambush of devastating effectiveness. The dance hall itself seemed to exhale the violence. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. The mirror was shattered. The floor was ruined. Perry Tuttle stood behind his bar, looking at the wreckage of his business. He wiped a glass mechanically, his mind unable to process the financial and human loss. The party was over. The music had stopped. As the clock ticked toward 2:15, the initial panic gave way to a grim, organized recovery effort. Wagons were brought to the front of the hall to transport the wounded. The dead were moved to the side, covered with whatever cloth was available, tablecloths, coats, curtains. The layout of the bodies on the boardwalk told the story. A row of men who had been alive and drinking 10 minutes ago were now meat. The air in the room was still heavy. It tasted of sulfur and iron. It was a taste that would linger in the mouths of the survivors for days. It was the taste of the Newton General Massacre. The single shot that Anderson had fired to end the feud had not ended anything. It had been the first note in a symphony of destruction. And the conductor of that symphony had been a dying boy who had vanished into the night. The psychological impact on the Texans was profound. They had been bested. They had been broken. Their leaders were dead or dying. The invincibility of the drover was shattered. They had been defeated not by a posse or a sheriff, but by a lone gunman in a crowded room. The humiliation was as deep as the wounds. Outside, the prairie wind picked up, blowing dust down the street. It mixed with the blood on the boardwalk, creating a paste. The stars looked down on Newton, indifferent to the suffering. The universe did not care about the feud between the railroad men and the cowboys. It did not care about honor or vengeance. It only witnessed the physics of lead and flesh. The night was far from over. The medical grimness was just beginning. The amputations would start soon. The screams of the men under the surgeon's knife would replace the sound of the gunfire. But for now, in the immediate aftermath of the shooting, there was only the shock. The stunning, numbing realization that the dance hall had become a tomb. James Riley was gone. He had stepped off the stage of history as quickly as he had entered it. But he left behind a monument to his rage. 9 shots. 7 victims. In seconds. It was a feat of arms that defied belief. It was the act of a man who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. And in the dark, smoky confines of Perry Tuttle's dance hall, he had proved it. The sawdust, intended to absorb spilled liquor and tobacco juice, was now fully saturated with the lifeblood of 7 men, turning into a dark, coagulated paste that clung to the boots of anyone attempting to move across the room. The immediate priority for the uninjured survivors was the evacuation of the wounded. This was not a coordinated medical extraction, but a frantic, clumsy effort driven by panic and loyalty. The friends of Hugh Anderson reached him first. The Texas cattleman lay near the body of Mike McCluskey, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. The heavy-caliber bullet from James Riley's revolver had impacted the femur midway between the hip and the knee, shattering the strongest bone in the human body into jagged splinters. Anderson was conscious, his face gray with shock, his teeth clenched so hard the jaw muscles bulged beneath his skin. When 2 drovers grabbed his shoulders and his good leg to lift him, the movement of the fractured bone ends grinding against each other elicited a scream that cut through the murmur of the crowd like a knife. They carried Anderson toward the door, his ruined leg dragging uselessly, leaving a broad smear of red on the floorboards. The pain was absolute, overriding his earlier adrenaline. He was no longer the commander of a vengeance squad. He was a cripple facing the terrifying prospect of amputation. The men moved him out onto the boardwalk, the cool night, air hitting his sweat-drenched skin, inducing violent shivering. They laid him on the rough planks outside, shouting for a doctor, shouting for a wagon, shouting for anything that could dull the agony radiating from his thigh. Inside, the situation with Henry Kearns was a logistical nightmare. The giant Texan was a massive weight of muscle and bone, now dead weight in the literal sense. He had been shot through the chest, the bullet perforating his lung. He lay on his back, his chest heaving with spasmodic jerks as he tried to pull air into a cavity that was filling with fluid. Pink froth bubbled from his lips with every exhalation, running down into his beard. 4 men struggled to lift him. They grabbed his belt, his arms, and his boots. They slipped in the blood, cursing and straining. Kearns groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated in the chests of those holding him. They managed to drag him to the entrance, his boots catching on the threshold before hauling him out to lay beside Anderson. Billy Garrett was in a different state of decline. The shot to his shoulder and chest had done catastrophic damage to the vascular system. He was bleeding out rapidly. The blood did not ooze. It pumped with a rhythm that was slowing with every beat of his heart. He was propped up against the bar initially, but as his strength failed, he slid sideways. His friends grabbed him, their hands becoming instantly slick with his blood, making it difficult to maintain a grip. They carried him out by his coat and his legs, his head lolling back, his eyes staring unfocused at the ceiling beams. He was placed on the boardwalk, where the blood from his wounds pooled and began to drip through the cracks between the planks onto the dirt street below. The most tragic figure of the evacuation was Jim Martin. Martin had been the peacemaker, the man who stood up to stop the violence, and he had paid for his neutrality with a bullet to the neck. Unlike the others, Martin was ambulatory in the first moments after the shooting. He stumbled out of the dance hall under his own power, one hand clamped tight over the side of his neck. The blood forced its way between his fingers in dark jets. He walked out onto the boardwalk, looking around with a bewildered expression, as if looking for the person who had shot him. He took 3 steps toward the street, his knees buckled, and he collapsed face forward into the dust. He did not scream. He simply lay there, his life draining into the Kansas soil, a victim of a war he had tried to prevent. The innocent bystander, Patrick Lee, the railroad brakeman, was in a private hell of his own. The bullet had struck him in the abdomen, perforating the intestines. It was a wound that promised a slow, agonizing death from infection if the initial trauma did not kill him. He lay curled in a fetal position near the door, clutching his stomach. His cries were low and constant. His friends, fellow railroad men, lifted him gently. They despised the Texans, blaming them for the chaos, but in this moment, the animosity was secondary to the shared horror. They carried Lee to a nearby wagon, laying him on a bed of straw that would offer little comfort on the ride to the boarding house. The medical response began to mobilize within 10 minutes of the final shot. Dr. Boyd and Dr. Gaston, the town physicians, arrived on the scene carrying leather bags filled with the crude instruments of their trade. They were men hardened by the frontier, accustomed to treating gunshot wounds, knife slashes, and crushing injuries from the rail yard. But the scene at Hyde Park tested even their resolve. The boardwalk outside Perry's had become a triage station. Lanterns were brought close, casting a yellow jumping light on the pale faces of the wounded. The doctors moved from man to man, making rapid assessments of survivability. Dr. Boyd knelt beside Hugh Anderson. He cut away the trouser leg with a pair of shears, revealing the devastation. The thigh was swollen and misshapen, a dark bruise spreading rapidly under the skin where the blood was pooling internally. The entry wound was a small, dark puncture. The exit wound was a jagged tear where the bullet and bone fragments had blown out. Boyd probed the wound with his fingers, checking the artery. He confirmed a pulse in the foot, which meant the femoral artery was intact, a miracle that saved Anderson from bleeding to death in minutes. However, the bone was pulverized. Boyd looked at Anderson and told him the leg might have to come off. Anderson, through his grit teeth, swore he would kill anyone who tried to amputate. The triage continued. Henry Kearns was dying. The doctors could do little for him but wipe the froth from his lips and administer a dose of morphine to ease his passage. The chest wound was sucking air. The lung had collapsed. There was no way to repair the damage in 1871. Kearns was a man drowning in his own fluids, his immense strength now working against him as his body fought a losing battle for oxygen. He died after several days, the massive chest finally still. Billy Garrett would die after several days as well. The blood loss was too severe. His face turned a waxen white, his extremities cold to the touch. He drifted into unconsciousness and simply ceased to breathe. The doctors pulled a sheet over his face and moved on. The death toll was rising. The vengeance of the Texans had resulted in their own slaughter. Patrick Lee was transported to a room where the doctors could operate. The surgery for a gut shot was a grim affair. Without anesthesia beyond chloroform or whiskey, and with no concept of sterile technique, the doctors would have to open the abdomen to sew up the perforations. It was a procedure with a high mortality rate, often resulting in peritonitis. Lee was conscious enough to know his chances were slim. He gripped the hand of a friend, dictating a message to his family in the East, his voice a whisper over the noise of the town. Inside the dance hall, the cleanup began even while the bodies were still warm. Mike McCluskey lay where he had fallen. He was no longer a threat or a target. He was a corpse. The town marshal, or what passed for authority, ordered his removal. Two men grabbed McCluskey's arms and dragged him toward the rear door. They did not carry him with the same reverence the Texans showed their own. McCluskey was the instigator in the eyes of many, the man whose return had brought this storm. His body was loaded onto a dray cart, his head bouncing on the wood, and taken to the undertaker's rooms. The 2 bullets from Anderson's gun had done their work. The neck wound and the chest wound were both fatal. The interior of the dance hall was a ruin. The mirror behind the bar was shattered, the glass crunching under the boots of the men cleaning up. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes, marking the erratic trajectory of the firefight. Perry Tuttle walked through his establishment, holding a lantern high. He looked at the blood-soaked sawdust. He knew he would have to shovel it out, burn it, and lay down fresh wood shavings. The smell of death had permeated the wood of the walls. It was a smell that scrubbing would not remove easily. He ordered his staff to bring buckets of water and lye. The business of Hyde Park had to continue. But for tonight, the doors would remain closed. As the news of the massacre spread, the reaction of the town was polarized. The North Side residents, the merchants and families, locked their doors and shuttered their windows. They feared that the Texans, enraged by the deaths of their leaders, would burn the town. They loaded their shotguns and waited in the dark. The South Side, however, was in a state of shock. The invincibility of the Texas drover had been shattered. They had seen their toughest men cut down by a sickly boy. The streets emptied, the other saloons closed, the music stopped. The only activity was around the doctors and the undertaker. The physical reality of the injuries sustained by the survivors required immediate and brutal intervention. Anderson was moved to a room in the Santa Fe Hotel. He was placed on a sturdy table. Dr. Boyd prepared for the procedure to set the leg. There was no X-ray to guide him. He had to use his hands to manipulate the jagged ends of the femur back into alignment. Anderson was given a heavy dose of chloroform. A rag soaked in the chemical held over his nose and mouth until his thrashing ceased. The doctor and 2 assistants then began the physical labor of traction. One man held the hips, the other pulled on the ankle with all his strength to overcome the contraction of the thigh muscles. Dr. Boyd manipulated the bone fragments at the break site. The sound of the bones grating together was audible in the room. Anderson moaned through the anesthesia, his body registering the pain even if his mind was suppressed. Splints were applied, heavy wooden boards bound tight with linen bandages to immobilize the leg. Anderson would remain in that bed for weeks, his leg suspended, fighting infection. The wound was packed with lint and carbolic acid, a stinging application intended to ward off gangrene. The heat of the Kansas summer made the risk of infection high. Flies were a constant menace, attracted to the blood and the sweet smell of the suppuration that would inevitably follow. Patrick Lee underwent surgery on a kitchen table. The doctors opened his abdomen, the smell of the perforated bowel filling the room. They found the tears in the intestine and stitched them with silk thread, rinsing the cavity with water. It was a desperate attempt. Lee survived the surgery, but his face was gray, his pulse thready. He was placed in a bed, fever already beginning to rise as the bacteria from his gut entered his bloodstream. The bodies of the dead, Kearns, Garrett, Martin, McCluskey, and eventually Lee, were laid out in a row at the furniture store that served as the makeshift morgue. The undertaker worked through the night. He washed the blood from their faces, plugged the bullet holes with wax and cotton, and dressed them in whatever clean clothes could be found. The sheer size of Kearns required a custom coffin. He would not fit in the standard pine boxes stacked in the rear. The carpenter was woken up and set to work, his hammer blows echoing in the silent street as he built a box large enough for the giant. The street outside the dance hall remained a crime scene, though no investigation in the modern sense would take place. The blood dried in the dirt, turning black. Dogs from the town sniffed at the stains until they were chased away. The weapons of the dead men had been collected: Anderson's Colt, Garrett's Remington, McCluskey's malfunctioning revolver. They were placed in a box at the marshal's office, the steel cold and heavy, the chambers empty or containing the spent casings of the lethal rounds. By 3 in the morning, the immediate crisis had stabilized into a grim vigil. The screaming had stopped. The running had stopped. The town settled into a heavy, fearful silence. The Texans retreated to their camps or to the rooms of their wounded friends. They were leaderless and demoralized. The river of blood that had flowed from Perry Tuttle's dance hall had drained the aggression from them. They sat in small groups, whispering about the boy, the shadow, James Riley. They touched the handles of their guns but did not draw them. The cleanup at the dance hall continued. Buckets of bloody water were thrown into the alley. The floor was scraped. The physical evidence of the massacre was being erased, but the stain on the town's history was permanent. The sheer brute force of the event, the close-range nature of the shooting, the high caliber of the weapons, the devastating injuries, shocked even the hardened frontiersmen. was not a duel of skill. It was a butchery. Jim Wilkerson, who had survived with facial wounds from the shattered mirror and a grazing shot, sat in a corner of the hotel lobby. He held a bloody rag to his face. He was the highest-ranking Texan left standing, but he had no fight left in him. He looked at his hands, which were shaking. He had seen the face of the boy as he fired. He had seen the muzzle flashes. It was an image that would haunt him. The relentless nature of the attack, the way Riley had advanced into the smoke, firing with both hands, was something Wilkerson could not reconcile with the frail figure he had ignored earlier in the night. The sun would rise in a few hours, revealing the full extent of the carnage to the light of day. But for now, under the cover of darkness, Newton licked its wounds. The doctors washed the blood from their hands in basins of water that turned pink. The undertaker measured the bodies, the carpenter sawed the wood. The machinery of death and recovery ground on, fueled by the violence of the night. The Hyde Park gunfight was over, but the dying was not. The consequences of those few minutes of gunfire would ripple out for years, crippling men like Anderson and burying men like Martin. The river of blood had flooded the banks of the Arkansas River Valley, and when it receded, it would leave behind a landscape permanently altered by the ferocity of the human animal. August 21st, 1871. The sun rose over Harvey County with a blinding clarity, illuminating the wreckage of the previous night without mercy. The morning light did not soften the scene at Hyde Park. Rather, it exposed the gruesome details that the darkness had obscured. On the boardwalk in front of Perry Tuttle's dance hall, the blood of the 4 dead men and the numerous wounded had dried into a dark, resinous crust that filled the grain of the wood. The flies, dormant during the cool of the pre-dawn hours, descended in swarms, their buzzing a low electric hum that replaced the piano music of the night before. Newton was no longer a boom town celebrating commerce. It was a crime scene, a battlefield, and a morgue, all contained within a few city blocks. The town woke to a paralysis of spirit. The sheer scale of the violence, 8 men shot in a space smaller than a rail car, had stunned the population into a collective silence. The residents of the North Side, the shopkeepers and the families who had huddled in their homes with shotguns across their laps, emerged slowly. They walked to the tracks, the iron dividing line of the settlement, and looked across at the South Side. They saw the shattered windows of the dance hall. They saw the dark stains on the ground. They saw the dray wagons moving slowly toward the furniture store, carrying the pine boxes that would serve as the final resting places for the combatants. The realization settled upon the town leaders that the wickedest city in the West had finally lived up to its name, and the cost of that reputation was becoming unbearable. In the Santa Fe Hotel, Hugh Anderson lay in a room that smelled of chloroform, carbolic acid, and the metallic tang of his own blood. The morphine administered by Dr. Boyd had dulled the sharpest edges of the pain. But the deep, throbbing ache of his shattered femur was a constant companion. His leg was immobilized in a crude wooden splint elevated to reduce the swelling that threatened to cut off circulation to his foot. Anderson was a prisoner of his injury. The man who had walked into the dance hall as an executioner was now a helpless invalid, dependent on the very people he had terrorized. His face was gray, beaded with the sweat of a low-grade fever that signaled the beginning of the body's inflammatory response to the trauma. The legal machinery of the county, weak and distant though it was, began to turn. Warrants were issued for the arrest of Hugh Anderson for the murder of Mike McCluskey. The town marshal, emboldened by the daylight and the backing of the outraged northern citizens, spoke of taking Anderson into custody. But the reality was more complex. Anderson was surrounded by a guard of Texas drovers who had not been involved in the shooting but were loyal to the Anderson name. They sat in the hallway of the hotel and on the porch, their guns conspicuous. They made it clear that no lawman would take Anderson while he was in his bed. The standoff created a tension that vibrated through the hotel, a threat of further violence that kept the marshal at bay. The search for James Riley began at dawn. A posse of sorts, comprised of railroad detectives and local volunteers, scoured the town. They checked the boarding houses, the livery stables, and the shacks along Sand Creek. They found nothing. The Shadow had lived up to the moniker bestowed upon him. He had vanished into the prairie night as completely as if he had never existed. There were no tracks leading away from the alley behind the dance hall that could be definitively linked to him. The hard-packed earth of the street yielded no clues. Riley, the consumptive boy who had unleashed a massacre, had simply ceased to be part of the geography of Newton. Rumors flew that he had died of a hemorrhage on the plains or that he had ridden to a secret camp, but no physical evidence was ever found. He left behind only the bodies of his victims and a legend that would terrify the gunmen of the West for a generation. As the day progressed, the toll of the massacre continued to rise. Patrick Lee, the railroad brakeman who had taken a bullet to the gut, fought a losing battle against peritonitis. The perforation of his intestines had released bacteria into his abdominal cavity, and the infection spread with terrifying speed. His fever spiked, his abdomen became rigid and distended, and his delirium took him back to the rail yards of the East. He would die after several days, the fifth fatality of the gunfight. His death galvanized the railroad workers. They threatened to burn down Hyde Park in retaliation. The town stood on the precipice of a full-scale riot, held back only by the exhaustion that permeated every layer of the society. The disposal of the dead became a logistical necessity. The heat of August meant that decomposition was rapid. The undertaker worked without pause. Henry Kearns, the giant, was buried in his custom-built box. Billy Garrett and Jim Martin followed. Mike McCluskey, the man whose return had sparked the inferno, was buried in the local plot, his grave marked simply. There were no grand processions, no eulogies celebrating their lives. They were planted in the Kansas dirt with haste, the town anxious to hide the evidence of its barbarity. The cemetery on the outskirts of town expanded significantly in a single day, the fresh mounds of earth standing as a stark ledger of the cattle season. In the days that followed, the focus of the Anderson faction shifted from vengeance to extraction. Hugh Anderson could not stay in Newton. The risk of lynching by the railroad men or arrest by the county authorities was too high. His father, a man of immense wealth and influence in Texas, was contacted by telegraph. Money began to flow. Bribes to officials, payments to the railroad staff, and fees for a special transport. A plan was hatched to smuggle the wounded man out of the hostile territory. It was a delicate operation, requiring the cooperation of the very railroad that employed the men Anderson's faction had killed. The extraction took place under the cover of a moonless night, nearly a week after the shooting. A train was held at the depot, steam hissing quietly from the engine. Anderson was carried out of the hotel on a stretcher, his men forming a phalanx around him. The movement caused him excruciating pain. Every step the bearers took sent a shockwave through his fractured leg. He bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. They loaded him into a baggage car, laying the stretcher on a pile of straw to dampen the vibrations of the track. The doors were slid shut, sealing him in the darkness. The train pulled out slowly, gathering speed as it headed south and west, taking the primary antagonist of the Hide Park gunfight away from the justice of Newton. Anderson would survive his wounds, though he would carry a limp and the scars of the night for the rest of his life, until violence eventually claimed him years later in another dispute. With Anderson gone and Riley vanished, the energy of the feud dissipated, leaving behind a vacuum that was filled by a profound sense of revulsion. The Newton General Massacre, as it came to be known, was the breaking point for the Santa Fe Railroad. The executives in Topeka and Boston looked at the reports of the violence, the dead employees, and the disruption of trade, and made a cold corporate decision. Newton was too wild, too uncontrollable, and too dangerous for the long-term vision of the company. The railhead had served its purpose, but the cost of doing business in blood was too high. They accelerated their plans to push the tracks further west. The construction crews who had been pausing in Newton redoubled their efforts. The sound of sledgehammers on spikes moved westward away from the town. The rails reached toward the next horizon, toward a new settlement called Dodge City. The cattle trade, which followed the iron rails like a migratory herd, began to shift. The drovers, sensing the hostility in Newton and the opening of new markets closer to the range, began to drive their herds past Harvey County. The Chisholm Trail, which had poured its wealth into Newton for a single explosive season, began to bend. By September, the change in Newton was palpable. The great herds that had ringed the town were thinning out. The camps that had housed thousands of cowboys were struck, the canvas tents folded and loaded onto wagons. The dust clouds that had choked the air for months began to settle. The streets of Hyde Park, once a 24-hour carnival of vice, grew quiet. Saloons that had been packed to the rafters stood empty, their bartenders wiping glasses for customers who no longer arrived. The dance halls, including Perry Tuttle's, found themselves without dancers. The music that had been the heartbeat of the South Side faded, replaced by the wind rattling the loose boards of the hasty construction. The bloody Newton reputation acted as a repellent for legitimate investment. Settlers looking for farmland bypassed the town, fearing for their safety. The town company, desperate to salvage their venture, began a campaign to clean up the municipality. They enforced the ban on weapons with a new rigor now that the massive numbers of Texans were gone. They closed the worst of the gambling dens. They invited churches to build on the north side. They courted a different kind of immigrant, the Mennonites, hard-working pacifists from Russia who were looking for wheat land and had no interest in cattle or guns. Perry Tuttle tried to keep his dance hall open, but the massacre had stained the location permanently. Men were superstitious. They did not want to drink or gamble in a room where ghosts walked. The bloodstains on the floorboards were scrubbed, but the memory was indelible. Business collapsed. Tuttle eventually closed the doors, the building standing as a hollow monument to the violence of August 20th. It would eventually be torn down, the wood repurposed or burned, erasing the physical structure where the West had been so thoroughly wild. As October brought the first frost to the prairie, the transformation was complete. The heat that had fueled the tempers of the summer was replaced by a chill wind from the north. The grass turned brown and brittle. The streets of Newton, once a river of mud and manure, froze into hard ruts. The cattle pens west of town stood empty, the gates swinging open in the wind. The shouting of the drovers, the crack of the whips, and the gunfire were gone. The railroad depot remained, but its function changed. It was no longer the terminus of the cattle drive. It was a way station. Trains stopped to take on water and coal, then continued west to where the action was. The conductors looked out at the town and told the passengers the story of the big fight. They pointed to the spot where McCluskey fell, where Bailey died, where the boy Riley stood. The events of the summer became a story, a commodity to be sold to tourists, while the reality of the town settled into a quiet, agricultural existence. The survivors of the night carried the physical and psychological shrapnel with them. Jim Wilkerson, the last of the Texas leadership who remained in the region, drifted into obscurity, his face scarred by the glass from the mirror. He never spoke of the night at Perry's. The trauma of seeing his friends slaughtered by a single gunman silenced him. The railroad men who survived, like the friends of Patrick Lee, stayed on the line, but they carried a deep hatred for the Texas cattlemen that would color labor relations on the frontier for decades. The legacy of the Hyde Park gunfight was not in who won or lost, for everyone had lost. It was in the lesson it taught the railroad and the towns of the West. It proved that the chaotic, unregulated coexistence of the industrial East and the wild South was unsustainable. It forced the evolution of the cowtown. Future terminals like Dodge City and Ellsworth would be built with stricter deadlines, heavier law enforcement, and a clearer separation of vice and commerce. The massacre at Newton was the growing pain of the frontier, a spasm of violence that forced the maturation of the American West. By the time the snow began to fall in late November, covering the Boot Hill Cemetery in a blanket of white, the graves of the combatants were just mounds in the frozen earth. The town of Newton had survived the season, but it had been cauterized. The wildness had been burned out of it by the gunpowder of James Riley and Hugh Anderson. The cattle trade moved on, seeking new pastures and new towns to corrupt, leaving Newton to the farmers in the quiet winters. The single season of 1871 had been enough. The roar of the guns had ended, and the silence of the plains reclaimed the land, burying the echoes of the fight under the drifting snow.